Let me call the committee to order. We're meeting today to consider two pieces of legislation. Both have been properly noticed and circulated, and there are copies of the bills and timely filed amendments available on each side of the dais. Amendments filed after the deadline have been circulated electronically. Pursuant to committee rules, members of the committee may submit written opening statements for the record. I ask that members may revise and extend the remarks on the bills that we are considering at this markup, and have those remarks included as part of the record. If there's no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3I and House Rule 11, Clause 2, I announce that I may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote or the ayes and nays have been ordered. The item for consideration is H.R. 823, sponsored by Representative Neguse of Colorado. I ask unanimous consent that subcommittees on national parks, forests, and public lands and on energy and mineral resources be discharged from further consideration of the bill. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I will now recognize the sponsor of the legislation, the representative from Colorado, Mr. Neguse. Time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your leadership on this committee. I'm proud to have introduced the Colorado Outdoor Recreation and Economy Act, H.R. 823. I appreciate your support of this bill. The CORE Act is a critically important piece of legislation, not only to my district, but to the entire state of Colorado. It comports with a companion piece of legislation being carried by Senator Bennett in the United States Senate. Over 70% of Coloradans participate in outdoor recreation each year, which drives $28 billion in consumer spending annually in my state. And our public lands in Colorado really define who we are as a state. Folks in Colorado understand that getting outside doesn't only improve our health, it contributes to a higher quality of life and a booming economy that supports $9.7 billion in wages across the state. This bill is the product of years and years of stakeholder work over a decade. It incorporates 4 different component pieces, and very appreciative and grateful to the many stakeholders and local communities that were so deeply involved in preparing the different component pieces of this legislation. I look forward to the amendment process today, to the markup, and again, I want to thank the chairman for his leadership and for bringing this bill to a markup.
Will the gentleman yield?
Gentleman will yield.
I just want to add my support for this important piece of legislation. Colorado has seen incredible growth the last number of years, and while we have always been a state that where everybody loves our outdoors, the reason why we are such a special place is because of our outdoors. We're loving it to death in many ways, and that's why it's so important that we consider bills like this legislation to promote outdoor activity and also promote preservation of appropriate activity in appropriate places. So I really want to commend my colleague. This is the result of years of stakeholder engagement, both with Congressman Neguse and his predecessor, Congressman, now Governor Polis. And I think that it's a really sensible approach to land management. I'm very pleased to support it, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman DeGette, for your leadership and for fighting these battles over the course of many years. And my distinguished colleague from Colorado raises an important point, which is to say, consistent with the years of stakeholder work that has gone into this bill, there are many people before me who have been working on different component pieces of this bill for quite some time. People like my predecessor, Congressman Polis, now the governor of the state of Colorado, who strongly supports this bill, as well as people like Congressman John Salazar, who represented the 3rd Congressional District in Colorado for many years. One of the bill's component pieces to the CORE Act is a bill that he introduced in multiple Congresses. And so I am grateful for their collective leadership, and consistent with our effort to promote the Colorado outdoor recreation industry and economy, would encourage every member of this committee, provided we can get this bill through the markup, to come visit us in Colorado and visit some of these incredible public lands and wild places. And with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Does any member wish to be recognized? Mr. Curtis, I think You made the request?
For the bill or on the bill?
On the bill? Sir,
Yes, please.
you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the work of my friend from Colorado, Mr. Neguse, to pursue public lands legislation. This is important work. It's hard work, but it needs to be done. A few months ago, I asked many of you to support my bill, and was pleased that you were willing to do so. And like your bill, my too went through decades of stakeholder involvement and building consensus, and to surprise of many people, we actually got ranchers and environmentalists in the same room to agree on very difficult legislation. But as much as I want to support your bill, I feel like there is a fatal flaw, and that is that the consensus is not deep enough. It doesn't have the support of Mr. Tipton, who has about 65% of this land in his district. And in my opinion, we need to do more work to find that consensus. Without that consensus, the probability of this thing getting through the Senate and into law signed by the President is near zero. And I believe that there's still work to be done. And I wish that we would have the opportunity to do that and have that stakeholder involvement before we bring it for a hearing and before we bring it for markup. And I believe this is not balanced enough and has not gotten through enough stakeholder involvement to get that consensus needed from the Colorado delegation, both in the House and in the Senate. And I also understand there's some concern from the Forest Service and even a county in that area that doesn't support this bill. And I really applaud conservation, and my bill itself designated 600,000 areas of wilderness, and it's not that I'm opposed to that. I just would like to see a greater stakeholder involvement and further reaching across the aisle. And therefore, I feel like we're not ready for this hearing, and urge my colleagues to not support the Core Act. And that's difficult for me because I want to support it and hope we can get to that point where we can support it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Any other member wish to be recognized before we consider amendments? If there's no further debate on the legislation, we'll begin the amendment process. Without objection, the ANS offered by Mr. Neguse is considered to be as read and open to amendment at any point. Representative Curtis, you have the first amendment. Curtis, number one, you're recognized for 5 minutes in support of that amendment. Sir?
Thank you. I put forth Amendment 823, and as I said before in my comments, I'm trying to resolve the issue of the congressman who has a large percentage of this area in his district not supporting this bill. My amendment would fix that by simply removing any land in the Colorado's 3rd congressional district from the effects of the bill. As you could see, there's about 65% of the bill in Mr. Tipton's district, and that's my amendment. It's to simply take that portion of it out and let the rest of it go forward unless we can get his support for that. And I hope going forward that we can work with all the members who are affected to get the support in their district. I feel like that's one of the problems we have on this in this committee is putting forth legislation in another member's district without their approval. And I know firsthand, because of the nature of my district, that sometimes this can actually cause more divisiveness in the district than if we went a little bit slower and involved them, and sometimes take us further away from resolution. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Sure. Any further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chair, move to strike the last word.
Mr. Goose?
I do appreciate Mr. Curtis's remarks. I oppose the amendment, and I must say, I do think it's a little bit ironic because the next bill that we're going to be considering in this markup is the Ranking Member's Restore Our Parks and Public Lands Act, which is a bill that I support, and a bill that will affect a number of districts, some of which are not represented by folks on this committee. So at the beginning of this Congress, for context, many of us voted to pass the John D. Dingell Conservation Management and Recreation Act, which protected public lands throughout the country outside of each of our home districts, or at least certainly some of ours. So as federal policymakers, we certainly make choices every day that affect constituents that aren't necessarily in our districts, and that's okay. And we have a duty as members of this committee, in my view, to listen to folks who are advocating for their values and their priorities. And so, again, while I do appreciate Mr. Curtis's remarks at the end of the day, I think it's also important contextually to remember that this bill is supported by a plethora of people and local leaders and community organizations, ranchers and others in the area that Mr. Curtis mentioned in the 3rd Congressional District. This includes, just a short list, this isn't everyone, the County of San Miguel, the County of Gunnison, Eagle County, San Juan, which happens to be partially in my district, partially in Mr. Tipton's, San Juan County, Ray, Pitkin County, as well as the town of Crested Butte, the town of Carbondale, the town of Glenwood Springs, Telluride, Ophir, Ridgeway, Snowmass Village, Mountain Village. So I think the bill has broad support from across our state, which is why it's a statewide bill consistent with the bill that's introduced, the companion measure in the Senate. And so with that, I would urge a no vote on this amendment. Also would ask unanimous consent to offer letters of support from the 20 counties and municipalities in the 3rd Congressional District that I mentioned, as well as a number of other organizations, which I'll submit to the chairman.
Without objection, so ordered. Someone else? Mr. Lambert?
Mr. Chairman, I would urge people to vote for this amendment. It has significant impact on the 3rd Congressional District, and although there are a number of people that like this bill, there are people in Colorado that do not like this bill. And I think we need to work harder for more consensus. And Representative Curtis has put his finger on the problem on this bill. Some people would like the wilderness designation, and that fits their particular recreational objectives or philosophy.
Unanimity?
Even if they don't go into the areas, they like knowing that it's there, I guess. But there are people who want access to these areas who would not have it. Motorized trail users, for instance, bicycles. There are people that would not have access, and they would be shut out from this, shut out from access under provisions in this bill. So when we're talking about 400,000 acres, we need to have more consensus, and that's exactly what this amendment is striving for. So let people concentrate. They know their own districts better. We're not saying you can't legislate in other people's districts, but I think we should all agree that people know their own districts as well as other people, and I would think better than other people around the country. So we should have deference to the 3rd Congressional District, and to not have it, I think, is another fatal flaw in this bill. So let's look for opportunities to help Colorado and the entire West, for that matter, to have good recreation in the future, but this bill does not accomplish it because of those reasons. There's also a wildfire issue here that needs to be addressed. There are 8,000 acres that are reduced for the opportunities for forest management, and unfortunately, we've had some wildfires in Colorado in recent years. I can think of 3 major ones in the last 17 years, and that's just in my neck of the woods. There are others outside of that. So to not be more sensitive to what's best for forest management is another flaw in this bill. So I would urge adoption of the Curtis Amendment, and with that,
The gentleman yield.
yes, I would yield.
Where is Garfield County in Colorado? Is that in Tipton's district or a different?
Yes, that's in the 3rd Congressional District.
As I understand it, they do not support this one. They have
That's
in the
correct.
past, but they do not now.
That's
So
correct.
the next amendment will also deal with that issue as well. Thank you.
And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Recognize myself to comment on them. I'm opposed to Mr. Curtis's amendment, which I think promotes an extremely narrow view of Congress's responsibility to promote public lands for the benefit of all Americans. The CORE Act is the product of years of stakeholder engagement, including those in Colorado's 3rd District. I think it needs to be understood that the bill is not just for Colorado's 3rd District, but for the people of Colorado and to a great extent to the people of the United States. With that, if I would like to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Neguse for any further comments regarding the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Without belaboring the points that I made earlier, I would just, with respect to my colleague from Colorado, who I certainly enjoy serving with, I would just say, and he may not be aware of this, that the Intermountain Bicycling Association supports this bill, as well as a number of other recreation groups in Colorado. I think this notion that the bill will limit motorized access in any way is just not supported by the actual four corners of the legislation that we are considering. There are a number of areas addressed in the bill that are designed to ensure that quality off-highway vehicle experiences can continue in the future. Again, I think we've discussed this point at great length. I oppose this amendment, would urge my colleagues to vote against it.
Will the chairman yield?
Gentleman yields back. I'll yield to Mr. Kett.
I-
Whatever time I have remained.
I'd like to associate myself with Mr. Neguse's and also your remarks, Mr. Chairman, and point out that Colorado belongs to all Americans, not just those of us from Colorado, although we do feel special. And I think everybody's views need to be taken into account, which is what Mr. Neguse has done with his huge variety of stakeholders. I would also point out that survey after survey has shown, and most recently one that was done by my alma mater, Colorado College, where they do a poll every year about the state of the Rockies. And it shows the conservation in the West Pole. And this poll shows consistently a growing amount of support for responsible land management, including additional wilderness areas in Colorado. A few years ago, there was a poll done that showed 73% of Coloradoans approve of more wilderness, and that poll oversampled in the 3rd congressional district. So more people who live in that part of the state actually support more management of public lands. The last thing I'll say is that this bill is really a multifaceted bill. It's about 400,000 acres of public land in Colorado. About 80,000 of those acres, I believe, are wilderness designation. That has been studied and researched to really for a long time, and those lands are appropriate. But the other lands are also being used for really important land management that will benefit future generations. So I think over the years, and we're going to be talking in a few weeks about my Colorado Wilderness Act that I've spent hours talking to both Mr. Lamborn and Mr. Neguse about. I think that over time, Congress really, unfortunately, narrowed its thinking to just considering views from a very few stakeholders. And what we have to look at when we look at the use of public lands in the West these days, we have to look at stakeholders like county commissioners, but we also have to look at all the whole variety of agriculture, mineral, fishing, and hunting. We have to look at farmers and ranchers. We have to look at outdoor recreation and all of the facets, all of the groups that use these public lands. And that's what Mr. Neguse has done in developing this legislation, and that's why I oppose this amendment. And in fact, I would really encourage Mr. Lamborn and Mr. Tipton to really, and I know they have, to really sit down with us and look in depth at both Mr. Neguse's and my legislation, because all of these considerations have been taken into effect. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for yielding to me, and I yield back.
Yield back. Anyone else seek to be? Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. I appreciate the discussion we've had so far. It is important, I think, to realize consensus does not mean unanimous, but it also does not mean majority. And then, unfortunately, one of the constitutional principles which we deal with is the idea of you protect the rights of the individual, no matter how many people may or may not be opposed to that particular right. I also would like to point out that we do need to have greater dialogue in this. In the hearing on this particular bill, Mr. Tipton was here and was not allowed to actually participate or ask questions of it, which is one of the sad parts in the narrative of this particular bill. I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. I'd like to point out that I hope while it may appear that my intentions are to postpone or to stall this bill, that's really not correct at all. And I actually believe that for this bill to make it through the legislative process and into law, we must slow down and take this step. Otherwise, we can fool ourselves and get it through this committee and get it onto the floor and perhaps even through the House, but never into law without slowing down and building this consensus. I would like to applaud the fact that we're dealing with this through congressional legislation, and sometimes we deal with these through an Antiquities Act, which is probably the worst possible way to deal with these. So I'm glad that we're here. I'm glad that we're having this discussion, but the reason congressional action is so powerful is because it builds consensus, and you don't get to take a winner-take-all philosophy. And the discussions with Mr. Tipton and others that it would take to get on board and to support this bill would be some painful compromise, which I also experienced in my bill. But at the end of the day, we came out with a bill that could make it into law and could actually change the situation on the ground. So it's my real hope that that will eventually take place, and this bill will gain that compromise needed to get into law. And I hope that we can eventually be successful with that. I yield my time.
Would the chairman yield, or ranking member yield?
Back? Apparently, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, and I would just want to reiterate something I said a minute ago. We do have the legal right in this committee to legislate over public lands in all 50 states and offshore. We have that legal right. But when we're saying that we have consensus and we haven't addressed the concerns of the people and the representative in whose district we are legislating, it's clear we don't have consensus. So who here would like someone to come in and tell you what should be done in your district and not get your agreement or get your input, get your feedback, and then they say they have consensus? I don't think any one of us would stand for that. So that's why I think we should support this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else want to be,
Just for a minute, Mr. Chairman, if
Blanc?
I may. Yeah, I appreciate the gentleman's statement there, but in my time here in Congress, there has been more than once, several times, when decisions were made by this committee and Congress and the administration, where people in my district actually opposed the whole concept of a legislation, and yet nobody gave a dime about that opposition. So the gentleman's statement is not exactly true. If you're talking about the United States, the committee has the authority. We have done the work pursuant to that authority, but it's not necessarily because the people in the district are in agreement with that. They're in complete opposition to that agreement. And so, you know, there has been times when we have done actually our ways, rightfully, maybe lawfully, but again, not necessarily with the consensus of the people we represent.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will.
I understand what you're saying. I agree. I'm not arguing with what you're saying. We have the right to deal with legislation in an entire country and even override the wishes of the people in a particular area, as you gave some examples. That we have that right. But we shouldn't go and say we have the consensus of the people there when there's that kind of opposition. That's
Gentleman
what I
yield.
oppose. Thank you, and I yield
I
back.
reclaim my time and yield to the
Yeah,
gentleman.
I would just say, again, not to belabor the point, the letters that were entered into the record speak for themselves. I recognize that my colleague, Mr. Lamborn, opposes the bill as well as Mr. Tipton. That is certainly their right. But the reality is that Crested Butte is in the 3rd Congressional District. Carbondale is in the 3rd Congressional District. San Juan County is in the 3rd Congressional District. Ouray is in the 3rd Congressional District. Telluride is in the 3rd Congressional District. Those municipal and county leaders have submitted letters to this committee in support of the legislation that we will consider. So while I recognize the point, again, would urge a no vote on this amendment, and to the extent that, I would hope my colleague would be, intellectually consistent on future bills, including the Restore Our Parks Act and many others. I look forward to many amendments removing congressional districts and removing counties from the variety of public lands bills that this committee would consider. Absent that, again, would hope that we could move forward and support a no vote on this amendment. With that, I yield back.
Back. Anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. Gosar.
Yeah, I sit back interestedly, particularly after the discussion after last week in regards to the Outer Continental Shelf. In regards to, we said, listen, states like South Carolina and Florida and Massachusetts and the Northeast all had superiority and state rights issues. And now we're talking about, oh, these are the property of the people of the United States. At least let's be consistent about our process here. So from that standpoint, I find it kind of hypocritical that I hear the gentlelady talking about these are the people of the United States. Where was that discussion last week for the Outer Continental Shelf? And with that, I yield back.
Be recognized? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Curtis, designated as number 1. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. A recorded vote has been requested. The vote will be postponed pursuant to the prior announcement. Representative Gosar, you have the next amendment. Gosar number 2, you're recognized for in support of that amendment, and the floor is yours, Mr.
I thank the chairman. This amendment would simply require formal approval from Garfield Board of County Commissioners before the lands located within Garfield County will be subject to the Thompson Divide Withdrawal and Protection Area. This would not affect the lands in any of the counties that have expressed support for this mineral withdrawal, as the originator actually highlighted. Garfield County has expressed strong opposition to a permanent mineral withdrawal in this area and have major concerns about the economic implications such a drastic move would bring that. I would like to submit for the record a letter from Garfield County outlining their opposition to their inclusion.
So ordered.
Garfield County has consistently supported multiple use management of public lands and has even supported more limited withdrawals in the past. This aggressive push to permanently lock up these lands from oil and gas and mineral development, combined with recent state-level attacks on development, reflects a clear overreach by special interest enviro groups and Democrat allies. This does not reflect the will of Garfield County, nor many other rural counties that depend on oil and gas industry for jobs and revenue. This amendment will provide a very modest improvement that will empower local voices who have expressed opposition to this permanent withdrawal while allowing it to proceed for the counties that have expressed support. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and with that, I yield back.
And yields. Anyone wish to speak to that amendment? Mr. Goose, you recognized?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to strike the last word. While I appreciate the spirit of this amendment, and I certainly deeply value the views and positions of the Garfield County Commissioners, I do think it's important to recognize Title III of this legislation really came to exist at the direct written request of Garfield County at that time in 2010, who asked Congress to introduce the proposed Thompson Divide legislation to give the divide the, quote, permanent protection that it deserves. The acreage to be withdrawn, the current map for the bill, was based on that feedback from Gunnison and Pitkin and Garfield counties. I understand that the county commissioners are still considering the bill. We've been working with their office, Mr. Gosar, just recently actually reached an agreement on a proposed methane pilot program. That's part of an amendment that we'll be considering today, which will harvest for beneficial use a wasted resource, and these provisions will also benefit the local economy, improve air quality, and reduce methane emissions. So, but again, understand that the county commissioners will make their own judgment. I do think while the input of local commissioners is certainly critical to any well-crafted bill, would just repeat the point I made earlier. It's also important to note that many local leaders and municipalities within the county are supportive of this bill. Many of the stakeholders that have been deeply involved in the Thompson Divide withdrawal negotiations, many of which I already mentioned, Glenwood Springs, Carbondale, and so forth. So again, appreciate the gentleman's comments and his amendment. I would respectfully encourage a no vote on the amendment, and with that, I will yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, yields. Any further debate on the question of the amendment offered by Mr. Gosar? Mr. Lamborn?
I would like to yield my time to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I do see the point that maybe in the past they initiated that aspect, but times change and we got to stay current with that application. I'm very aware of the way polls are actually concocted. I mean, I'll give you an example that strikes home. Just several years ago, there was a poll conducted on the Grand Canyon, and it had an 84% that they wanted the Grand Canyon to be a national monument withdrawn. However, the way that it was stated was very unclear. And when it was denoted in a different poll that actually said, by actually denoting the Grand Canyon as such defined by that poll, it would restrict use, restrict grazing, restrict access to firefighting. All of a sudden, it completely turned over the opposite. 80% were against that designation and thought protections were currently satisfactory. So if we're relying on polls, be very, very careful. And we also want to make sure that we're relevant to the times because information changes. I'll stick by my guns with Garfield County. They should have their animus noted. And I yield back.
Yields. Anyone else wish to be recognized on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is the amendment offered by Representative Gosar, designated as number 2. Of all those in favor, indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, indicate by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, can we have a recorded vote?
A recorded vote having been requested, the vote postponed pursuant to the prior announcement. Representative McClintock, you have the next amendment, McClintock number 5. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Floor is yours, Mr.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment, I think, is more in keeping with the purpose of the Wilderness Act and the professional recommendations of the U.S. Forest Service. At the April 2nd hearing for this legislation, the Forest Service, in its testimony, conveyed its findings that several of the proposed additions were not suitable to be added to the wilderness system. This amendment simply strikes those from the bill. And this was due to the fact that there were several characteristics in these areas simply inconsistent with wilderness designation. The 3 areas are these. First, the proposed Megan-Dickey Wilderness Addition. That's a single parcel encompassing approximately 3,900 acres of National Forest System lands adjacent to the existing wilderness. The forest plan does not recommend any of this area for wilderness designation because there are remnants of past timber harvests there, as well as the likelihood of unexploded ordnances in the area. As a result, the agency doesn't support the proposed addition of the Megan-Dickey Wilderness Addition. Second is the proposed Spraddle Creek Wilderness Addition. That encompasses about 8,400 acres. Of those, 872 are recommended for wilderness designation under the forest plan, and the Forest Service supports that acreage. The agency does not support, and this amendment strikes, adding the remaining 7,490 acres because of remnants from past forest management that are present in the area, along with continued access to a developed ski hut, which impacts the wilderness character of the area. These areas also include forest and rangeland habitats that are actively managed for a variety of forest health and fire prevention purposes, which would be severely constrained under this act. The final parcel this removes from the bill is the proposed Williams Fork Wilderness. That's 14 miles north of Silverthorne on the western slope of the Williams Mountain Range. None of this area was proposed for wilderness designation in the forest plan, given the presence of roads in the area. As a result, the agency doesn't support this as well. I mean, to declare areas that do not possess wilderness characteristics as wilderness very plainly undermines the integrity of the Wilderness Act, as well as the lands that possess those features. So with that, I would urge support of the amendment.
Any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this amendment for a number of reasons. Again, as I've stated previously, the designations in every portion of this bill, and in particular the Continental Divide portion of the bill, including those referenced in Mr. McClintock's amendment, which happen to be in my congressional district, are the results of years of collaboration among the local stakeholders, governments, and the Forest Service in terms of the local officials that are on the ground. I understand Mr. McClintock's amendment reflects the desire to essentially emulate the testimony that was given by the staff from the Forest Service headquartered in D.C., but that is vastly different and inconsistent with the views on the ground, including the Regional Forest Service staff. As I noted during this hearing, and I hope this is something we can work across the aisle on in future hearings, the Forest Service's recommendations were based on the White River National Forest Land and Resource Management Plan from 2002. And there is a statutory requirement that these forest plans be updated every 15 years. It's encouraged that there actually that happen more frequently, but nonetheless, at least 15 years as a baseline, and that has not happened in this instance and in a number of other areas, I suspect, in other districts represented on this committee. And so many of the concerns that were raised in the testimony were inaccurate or they were based on out-of-date information, and that is a shame. You know, conditions in Eagle County and in Summit County have changed. Again, these are areas of my district that I know and am very familiar with. They have changed dramatically over the last 17 years, as you can imagine, and so much of the plan is obsolete as a result. For example, Summit County's population has grown by more than 25% since the plan was completed, and visitation has grown even more dramatically, especially in the summer. Just to give you a couple of specific examples, with regard to the proposed Williams Fork Mountain Wilderness, the Forest Service testimony in April said that, quote, none of this area was proposed for wilderness designation given the presence of roads in the area, and so as a result, they didn't support the proposed addition. That is untrue. Apparently, the Forest Service has not been there recently, but there are no roads in the proposed wilderness. The forest plan specifically found that area to be capable of and available for wilderness recommendation, given the area the highest ranking from its evaluation for natural and free from disturbance. The gentleman mentioned the Megan Dickey addition. The Forest Service testimony stated it didn't support the proposal because there were, quote, remnants of past timber harvests as well as the likelihood of unexploded ordinances in the area. To the contrary, the only remnants of past timber harvests are outside of the proposed wilderness, and the agency has officially found the area capable of and available for wilderness recommendation. The Forest Service, just for the gentleman's benefit and for the peace of mind of the members of the committee, has no records of any unexploded ordinances being found there, and at any rate, the likelihood of finding that is no greater than other adjacent areas in the Holy Cross Wilderness. Additionally, there is nothing in the Wilderness Act that would prevent the safe handling of ordinances if they're found, and wilderness has never interfered with the safe handling of unexploded ordinances in the area. And then finally, just at the end of the day, with respect to commercial logging, these areas, again, are in my district. They are prized for recreation, watershed, wildlife, scenery, and ecosystem values, and commercial logging is not only uneconomical in these areas, but also generally inconsistent with the values the public wants protected, certainly in my district. And so these local communities do not want these places clear-cut for commercial gain. And to that end, I'd ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to submit to the record a letter that was sent by those counties in the areas that Mr. McClintock had mentioned, and 5 other counties actually as well, regarding this specific issue. With that, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will just quote from their letter and then we'll yield. There are special public lands in our counties that we strongly believe should be managed for values other than commercial logging. Perhaps more importantly, the letter also states that while these counties do value the services that the timber industry provides to their communities, not every acre of timber that could be logged should be logged. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, again, would urge a no vote respectfully, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else want to, any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment offered by Representative McClintock, designated as number 5. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Gentleman asked for a recorded vote, and the vote will be postponed pursuant to prior announcement. Representative Lambourne, you have the next amendment, Lambourne number 4. You're recognized for 5 minutes in support of that amendment. Sir?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to offer this amendment. What it does, it takes existing policy and codifies it into law so that there's no potential risk to our national security in the future. I'll explain. There is a HATS site in these wilderness areas. It stands for the High Altitude Aviation Training Site. It's run by the Colorado Army National Guard. And what it does, it's the only place in the country where the Department of Defense has the ability to train rotary wing aviators, both in the armed forces of our country and allies from other countries, how to safely fly rotary wing aircraft in mountainous and high altitude environments. It's the only place where this is done. And when you think of areas where we're in conflict like Afghanistan and northern Iraq, which are mountainous, this training is critical. This training has saved lives. So I don't want to see anything endangered. I don't believe there's any attempt to go after this training site. I'm glad for that. But I want to codify it into the language of this bill so that it's never a problem in the future. There is an existing policy by DOD called AP1, where there's an exception made for Colorado for this particular purpose. And I'm just taking that language and asking that it be put into the bill language, both for the wilderness site where it's currently located and nearby wilderness sites that could also be affected by the need for a quick landing. I met with the chief of the National Guard Bureau yesterday, General Joseph Langiel, and he agrees that this is an important policy. It has saved lives. The mountainous conditions where you sometimes have quick weather changes, you have icing, you have oxygen problems sometimes, all those things need specialized training. So if there's a problem with your helicopter in a conflict zone, you know what to do. So this is so critical. I think we'd all agree on the need for this. I just think we need to codify it into law, and that's what this amendment does. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
Anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. Neguse?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the comments of my colleague, Representative Lambourne. I oppose the amendment, and just to give folks some context, so of course, as bill sponsors, it's my intention, Senator Bennett's intention in the Senate to ensure that the bill would not adversely affect current or future military transit and training in Colorado. Senator Bennett's office spent years working constructively with representatives from the Colorado National Guard, the High Altitude Army National Guard Aviation Training Site, or HATS, as my colleague mentioned, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the U.S. Army, the U.S. Air Force, the FAA, and relevant land management agencies to ensure that this bill would allow for continued and future military training and transit in Colorado. Towards the conclusion of this multi-year conversation, in August 2018, the Department of Defense updated their area planning, or API guide. So that's the guide that Representative Lambourne mentioned, was updated to address this specific issue. So it's a result of that incredible stakeholder work and outreach that Senator Bennett's office did and many others to ensure that there would be no negative impacts, because I agree with the congressman, of course, we want to ensure that that's not the case. And so in the manual, they've included clarifying guidance on wilderness overflight in Colorado. The API, or AP1, I should say, update ensures that military overflight across Colorado, including the HATS mission, will continue. It ensures flight safety, mitigates risks now, and in the case of future land management designations, such as the new designations proposed here in CORE. Following this update, both DOD and the Colorado National Guard have confirmed that they had no concerns related to military overflights and the proposed designations. Senator Bennett commemorated this work in a letter to Department of Defense on January 17th, 2019. It explains in detail all of the actions that the interested parties have taken. I would ask for unanimous consent to submit that letter to the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
And then just to be sure, because again, we wanted to exercise as much caution as we could, and so our office has continued to stay in touch with DOD following the introduction of the CORE Act. We again received written assurances on May 9th, so this is last month, from DOD staff stating that the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Readiness has, quote, reviewed the language in Senate Bill 241, the companion measure to the CORE Act today, and they do not have any concerns regarding military overflight. And then obviously I know my distinguished colleague from Colorado is aware, in response to an inquiry from Representative Tipton, the House Armed Services Committee also reviewed the bill, the chairman, and in a letter dated June 25th, 2019, to Representative Tipton, House Armed Services Committee explained that the National Guard Bureau, again I'll quote, has no concerns with H.R. 823 as written, as the affected area is outside of the training area. And I'd ask unanimous consent to submit that letter to the record as well, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection?
So finally, again, I respect my colleague. I appreciate his efforts. I would say that given the AP1 guidance that has been issued, I believe this amendment is ultimately unnecessary. After years of work to address any questions, to confirm that DOD has no concerns with the bill as drafted, I just think it is risky to include last-minute language that ultimately could actually restrict the DOD's flexibility to review the flight guidelines as they see fit in years to come to be able to accommodate safer training and transit in Colorado. I know that's not the gentleman's intent, but that is the unintended consequence, in my view, of this amendment. And so, therefore, we're going to continue to listen to DOD's statements that they have no concerns related to military overflight. We'll continue to work with the gentleman to the extent there are any other issues that percolate, but I would respectfully urge a no vote on this
Will
amendment.
the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will yield.
I just want to add, Mr. Lamborn's concerns about hats are legitimate. I have spent many hours meeting with the Colorado National Guard also about this hats issue with respect to the CORE Act and also the Colorado Wilderness Act. And I think Mr. Neguse and Senator Bennett and I are all really committed to making sure that we preserve this important national security exercise, which really can only be done in a place like Colorado. But as Mr. Neguse says, these concerns by years of working with the agencies have been alleviated, and the agencies do not oppose this legislation. And they believe they're going to be able to continue these overflights as they have been. And the other point I would make, I find it a little bit ironic that this amendment would codify the regulations when so many of my friends on the other side of the aisle are not wanting to over-legislate, because these regulations change quarterly as the needs of the Department of Defense change and as the needs of these overflights change. And so if you codified this, then unfortunately you would be putting something into law that may not be useful in the future. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else wish?
I do.
You wish to be recognized?
Yeah.
Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. I'm actually saddened that this amendment has not been embraced, and would urge the sponsors, if indeed this bill goes forward, to continue to work with Mr. Lamborn when it comes to the floor. I have created wilderness in my tenure in Congress, something for which I am not necessarily proud. But in that wilderness, it was extremely significant that we dealt with the issue, because it was around it was around the Uter. We had to deal with the issue of overflight over WSAs. It was important, as we sat down there, not to just make the assumption that everyone would work together in the future. It was important that we put into statute what the limitations could or could not be, not because we didn't trust the BLM, in this case, Land Agency, and not because we didn't trust the Department of Defense, but because if you did not do that, it opens it up to litigation, so that any judge would make a decision based on other issues unless we specifically quantified and codified what kinds of activities could take place over a WSA in the airspace that went around the Uter. So I recognize how insignificant this is. And even if everyone is in agreement now, unless you have something specific in statute that would mitigate against potential lawsuits, you are overlooking a very extreme danger.
Would the gentleman yield?
So what I would, no, please, I would just urge you to continue to have these conversations going on, because if you don't simply do the codification, you open yourself up to all sorts of dangers in the future. Sad experience, I happen to learn that. I will yield to Mr. Lamborn if you like the time.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. I appreciate the work that you've done so far, and along with Senator Bennett, as far as it goes. as far as it goes. It's only regulatory. It's not statutory. And so, like Representative Neguse said, it can change quarterly. It could change any time. So I do always have a desire not to over-legislate. You are right, Diana, when you say that. But when it comes to national defense, I think I'm willing to do this because it's so important. This is the only such training site in the country. And when you have a regulation that can change, yeah, sure, everyone's in agreement today. So today, they have no dispute with this bill. But I did talk with the chief of the National Guard Bureau, General Langiel, a four-star general, yesterday. And he's concerned that this could change. And if it would ever change, it would be devastating. Right now, you can't fly within 2,000 feet over a wilderness area. And there is this exception for hats. But with a helicopter, weather changes quickly. You can lose power. You can have icing. You can go into a mountain pass, and there's a mountain right in front of you that you didn't expect. I mean, that's all part of the training, and that's why it's such a good training site. And so we want to preserve this. We can't take any chances, and we do need to codify it. I think there's really no way around it. So if you like the concept, I don't understand why you're not agreeing to make it established in black letter law. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Recognizing myself, let me yield time to sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Goose.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of quick points. One, just again, the letters and the various emails that we submitted to the record from the defense community certainly speak for themselves in terms of the fact that they don't oppose this bill as currently written or the Senate companion measure. But nonetheless, I would also say to this point about the regulations potentially changing, to the extent they would be changing in the future, they would be changed at the discretion of the Department of Defense, not this committee. So I'm not quite understanding that objection to having the Department of Defense ultimately retain its flexibility and its discretion to be able to regulate on that front as it sees fit. That being said, and I regret that the ranking member was unwilling to yield, because all I was going to say was, to the extent that Representative Lamborn, if you're willing to consider withdrawing the amendment, I am certainly willing to work with you as this bill gets to the floor about whether or not that accommodation can be reached. Our understanding, we got this amendment yesterday, is that the defense community has some concerns regarding subparagraph 4 of your amendment. And so, again, willing to engage in good faith on that front. But absent that, I would encourage a no vote on this amendment. With that, I yield.
Back. Anyone else wish to be recognized?
Would the chairman yield?
Mr. Gomar?
Thank you for yielding, and I'll make this very brief. This amendment is written so that it includes all the areas covered under the bill, not just the HATS Act. And the reason for that, and this is a critical difference that you don't contemplate in your bill, Fort Carson, which is about 100 miles away, 150 miles away, and is in my district, is where there's a combat aviation brigade, helicopters. And that's where a lot of the transit takes place, from there to HATS and back and forth. So I think it's really good that we have the Colorado exception, not just over HATS, which is a limited area, but for areas in transit between Fort Carson and HATS. Because right now you can't go under 2,000 feet. What if you're having engine trouble? Or what if you've, I could think of 100 scenarios. So that's another thing that is important about this amendment. I would love to work with you on this. Let's keep the dialogue open. I don't think I should withdraw the amendment. I think it's an important amendment and it'd make the bill better. But let's continue the dialogue. And if you want to say something, I'm happy to yield to you.
Thank you. And I apologize, we're talking past each other. Just to put a finer point on that last point, and we will certainly continue to work with you in good faith, and we'll look forward to that. I would say apparently the concern is that it's not so much subparagraphs 1 through 3 applying to the areas that you mentioned, to Fort Carson and others. It's the issue around number 4 and the idea of codifying the regulatory guidance that they have issued. I believe that there are concerns from the defense community that in doing so, it's going to limit their flexibility to adjust these flight guidelines into the future if you ultimately codify those into law. And so that's the rub, essentially. But in any event, so I'll yield back to the gentleman. Obviously, I encourage a no vote, but I will continue to work with you in the future.
Thank you. Reclaim my time. I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you. Gentleman yields.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Brown?
you know, I had an opportunity to review the amendment to the substitute amendment, and I apologize for coming in late. I was at a markup in transportation and infrastructure. I see the only difference is that subparagraph 4 in your amendment. You know, I flew military aircraft. I flew helicopters. I didn't fly under the, you know, the conditions that exist in these training areas. But as I read subparagraph 4, the conditions such as icing, engine power limitations, cloud clearances, and turbulence, these are conditions that are not considered normal flight conditions. And a military pilot is always able to take the necessary precautions and make the necessary maneuvers to put an aircraft into safer flight conditions. If I have engine power limitations, nothing prevents me from putting the aircraft into a position, whether lowering my altitude, changing my airspeed. There's no regulation that prevents it. There are regulations, though, that guide aviators on how to make adjustments in those situations, and that's why I support Mr. Neguse. If you codify this, then you make it too rigid. You're taking away the flexibility from the aviation community, the military aviation community, to regulate in this area, to take feedback from aviators on how best to respond to these other than normal flight conditions. So I support the intent of what you're trying to do, saying, hey, if there's an emergency or not necessarily an emergency, but a condition other than normal flight condition, let's make sure that that flight is okay to traverse this area. But absent your paragraph 4, that military aviator is going to be able to do what they need to do to avoid turbulence, to avoid to be clear of clouds under the regulations, to make adjustments because of engine power limitations, and to take whatever actions necessary when they're in an icing condition and either their equipment fails or they need to change altitude. So it's really unnecessary, and I could understand why the Department of Defense community is concerned that we're legislating in an area that is much, much better addressed through regulations. So to that, I would also oppose Mr. Lamborn's amendment on those grounds, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields. Anyone else wish to be recognized on the question of Mr. Lambert's amendment number 4? If not, and see no further debate, all those in favor of the amendment indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed indicate by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Gentleman has requested a recorded vote. That vote is postponed pursuant to prior announcement. The next amendment is by from Representative Holland. You have, and it's the next amendment is Holland number 1. Ms. Holland, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Support of that amendment.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, everyone. My amendment would make additional technical changes to the ANS to clarify provisions of the bill. I've been happy to work with Mr. Neguse, this Congress, to promote protection of Colorado's public lands and bolster the state's multi-billion-dollar recreational economy. These changes will not impact the purpose or intent of the CORE Act and are only intended to make minor changes to an already good bill. I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues to ensure that our public lands are protected for future generations, and I urge adoption of this amendment.
Any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, all those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Representative Westerman, you have the next amendment, Westerman number 3, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe that this amendment that I have is based on something that we should all be able to agree on, and that is good science and conservation. If my amendment were adopted, it wouldn't prevent Mr. Neguse from accomplishing his purpose of setting land aside in a wilderness area in Colorado, but it would simply make sure that we're implementing the best science as we move forward, hopefully not with just looking at wilderness areas in Colorado, but all across the country. As I looked at this bill and was trying to think about how to explain the points I would like to get across, I went back to when I was in forestry school, and I had the good privilege of having a classmate who was an accomplished physician who decided to go back to forestry school to learn how to take care of forest. And he had these great insights and great ways of illustrating, and he used his experience in the practice of medicine, and he even said, you know, forestry is really a lot like medicine. In medicine, you have the doctor, and then you have your patients. The doctor's ultimate desire is to make sure that he has healthy patients and that he has healthy communities. In forestry, the forester's ultimate desire is to make sure that you have healthy trees and that those trees create healthy communities or healthy forests. And if I could borrow from his illustrations and look at much of the forest land that's included in these wilderness areas, I think we have an unhealthy situation. And I don't base that just on what I say, and I would like to submit this report from the Colorado Forest on the 2018 health report without objection. And
Order.
And what they say in this report about the health of Colorado's forest is not very appealing. Matter of fact, it's almost a who's who of insects and diseases that are prevalent in Colorado's forest. It talks about the amount of overstocking in the forest. It talks about the number of people who are living in areas that are in danger of catastrophic wildfire. That number has increased by 50% in just a few years. And if we were to look at this as if it were a health issue, it would be almost like saying we're going to take these trees and we're going to put them in a colony where they can get no treatment. Because when we establish a wilderness area, we're saying we're creating this invisible barrier or border, and we're saying everything inside this border is not subject to any kind of management. It's not subject to any kind of intervention. We're going to let nature run its course inside this border. It's a bit like saying that, if we had a vaccine to help these trees and we chose not to vaccinate these trees, we chose not to give them any kind of health, and by doing this, we're going to see some devastating results in the future. It was mentioned about, stakeholders in the area didn't want to see clear cutting. Well, guess what? Nature is going to clear cut these forests. It's going to clear cut it with insects and disease and wildfire. And with this invisible barrier around it, there's not going to be any way to go in with efforts for reforestation or doing things to bring those view sheds back. I hope we all could agree that healthy forests are wonderful. They create better air quality, better water quality. They provide great outdoor recreation opportunities. They provide beautiful landscapes. And if we want to take an unhealthy forest and draw an invisible barrier around it and say, let's let Mother Nature take care of this forest, we certainly as Congress have the right to do that, but we should be fully aware of the consequences of making those types of decisions. I've helped get areas designated as wilderness area, but it was areas that had been through the study process that met all the criteria and that were healthy forests that were on track to be able to remain healthy and resilient over time. My bill simply creates some criteria to ensure that these forests are healthy before they're put into a wilderness area. it's a good application of science. The path that we're on is bad medicine, it's bad science, and I just can't go along with putting unhealthy forest into a wilderness area. That's why I have this amendment, and I yield back.
Anyone wish to be recognized? Mr. Neguse?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And with great respect for my colleague, Mr. Westerman, and certainly respect his expertise, and know this is an issue that he has brought up in past hearings on a variety of different bills. So appreciate his push on this front. And so I appreciate his suggestion. Ultimately, I believe that we should vote no on this amendment, primarily because it's an overly broad attempt, in my view, I think, to prevent new wilderness designations based on forest health concerns. One of the reasons why the hearings are so important in front of this committee is we have an opportunity to hear from people on the ground. And during the hearing on this particular bill, we had a chance to hear from Mr. Dan Gibbs, who's a former county commissioner in Summit County, one of the counties that has borne the brunt of wildfires in my district and in my state, as well as pine beetle infestation and so many other issues with respect to our forests. He now happens to be the executive director of Colorado's Department of Natural Resources, which is the agency that is in part a supervisory agency to the Forest Service agency that you just quoted from, the report that you submitted for the record, Mr. Westerman. And he was specifically asked if he had any wildfire concerns, given that his department includes the Division of Forestry for Colorado, regarding wildfires. With respect to any designations in H.R. 823, he responded that he does not. And I believe his experience is without reproach. He's a certified wildland firefighter. He's a member of the Governor's Forest Health Advisory Council, and as I said, former commissioner in Summit County and former chair of the Summit County Wildfire Council. So at the end of the day, I don't think this amendment is necessary. I think that existing law enables appropriate actions to be taken to the extent that they are necessary. This bill reiterates existing law. I'll quote, it provides that the Secretary may carry out any activity that the Secretary determines to be necessary for the control of fire, insects, and diseases. And that language regarding forest management in wilderness areas, again, I think contextually it's important to recognize it's the same exact language that was included in Congressman Tipton's Hermosa Creek Watershed Protection Act, which passed out of this committee back in 2014, long before I got here. So again, appreciate the gentleman's suggestion, but I would respectfully urge a no vote on the amendment. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman? I would just remind my friend and beg him to consider the harm that's done by neglect of our forests. An untended forest is no different than an untended garden. It will grow and grow until it chokes itself to death. We made the decision a century ago to establish the U.S. Forest Service to tend to our forests so that we could maintain them resilient in perpetuity for each generation rather than watching this century-long process of overgrowth, death, and regrowth. And I'd like to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Westerman.
Thank the gentleman from California. Wildfire is the kind of the last thing that we see on the landscape. It starts off with overstocking, with trees competing for nutrients. As we see warming temperatures, lower moisture rates in certain areas, these trees get really stressed. And when they get stressed, the insects and the diseases move in. That's what's happening in Colorado and in many places across our country right now. So it's about a lot more than just wildfire, but it usually culminates in wildfire, which is Mother Nature's way of resetting. And it's a vicious cycle. It takes centuries, if not millennia, for a forest to get self-regulated just by growing and being burned through wildfire. But we know the science where we can go in and intervene in that, and we can help these forests become restored at a much quicker rate. It's not an issue about is there more timber needed for sawmills and paper mills across the country. Our country is awash in timber right now. If we could go in and manage these areas, one of the main issues we would have is what would you do with the material that comes off of it? So I think we should be focusing our efforts on how do we talk about the sustainability of the wonderful resource of timber that we have. How do we use that more? And how do we restore these forests where they're healthy, where they could be more like a wilderness area, where natural fires could burn at low intensity and keep the forest healthy. But when we put this invisible barrier around the forest, we're forever taking away our ability to do that. And that's my caution in creating these wilderness areas in places where there are serious forest health concerns. So there may not be an immediate threat to wildfire, but if the stands are overstocked, if they have the wrong kind of species distribution in it, it may not be in our lifetime, but eventually there will be a threat of major wildfire, and we're seeing the intensity and the severity of those fires in other places across the country where management has been neglected. So again, I totally agree with the concept of wilderness areas, the spirit that it was set up in, and the right that we have to designate those areas across the country. But we should be responsible and implement the proper science and make sure that we're not creating future problems when we establish these wilderness areas. And I yield back to the gentleman from California.
Let me recognize myself and yield to Mr. Goose for my part of the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief and then yield to my distinguished colleague from California. Again, I appreciate Mr. Westerman's suggestion. I would just note that the lands within the proposed special management areas in this bill are available for a range of forest management activities that would be consistent with the central purposes for which they're proposed to be established. In many cases, boundaries were actually adjusted to ensure all methods of wildfire mitigation. I share your broader desire, Mr. Westerman, of course, to address looming wildfire challenges that we have across the country, and in particular in my state and my district. We live it every day. As you'll recall, we had a hearing with the Forest Service not that long ago before this committee where I raised the fact that local communities in my district are being forced to expend additional resources that should be borne by the federal government, not localities, with respect to this particular issue. So again, that's something that I care deeply about. I also, just to put your mind at ease, because I think, again, some of the there have been some misstatements regarding the nature of this bill. Of the 400,000 acres that are implicated in the bill, only 73,000 acres of the bill would be designated as wilderness. And over half of that, over half of the 73,000 are above tree line or they're unforested. So again, recognizing the suggestion, but I would respectfully urge my colleagues to vote against the amendment. With that, I yield to my colleague, Mr. Hoffman.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and I'll yield to my colleague, Mr. Lowenthal, in just a moment, but I have to say it has been, Mr. Westerman is right, of course. We should be thoughtful about how and where we designate wilderness, but these areas were not selected by throwing darts at a map. As Mr. Neguse just reminded us, there was a careful and thoughtful and exhaustive process, community-supported, broadly supported, that led to these proposals, and we should support that. But some of the other comments across the aisle have suggested that wilderness designation invariably leads to this virtual hellscape of disease and fire and calamity. And I really want to urge my colleagues across the aisle to get out a little more and maybe visit a wilderness somewhere, because it's not like that. They're actually spectacular, special places. They're beautiful. They do what they are intended to do, and I'm sure, I have every confidence they will in this case as well. So with that, I'll yield the balance of my time to Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you. First, I want to compliment Mr. Westerman. First, I enjoy this discussion. I think it's really important that we raise issues about forest protection, what's the best way to do it. And I believe this discussion is best held, if we're really interested in that, dealing with the concept of climate change. That's what we're really talking about. How does climate change impact forestry? What are the issues that need to be addressed as far as that? And I would certainly join with you in that discussion. I think that's really where we're leading towards. Not a specific thing to do at this moment or a specific intervention, but to really look at what is causing all these wildfires and what are the actions that are going to be needed to prevent wildfires. Thank you. Yes?
I think,
I would like to respond to both gentlemen from California. I agree, we have to protect the integrity of these wilderness areas. We do have beautiful wilderness areas because there's good forest health in these wilderness areas. There's wilderness areas in my state that are fantastic areas to recreate, to hunt, and it's because there was good forest management put in place and these wilderness areas were set on a path for long-term sustainability. So I wanted to protect the integrity of that. And also, if we want to talk about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, forests are our number one tool to combat that. It's been said they're the lungs of the earth. It's true. Forests breathe in carbon dioxide, release oxygen. We need more forest, more healthy forest. Forest fires put a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. Forests are not only the lungs of the earth, many times they're the kidneys of the earth. They purify water and clean water. So there's huge benefits to healthy forest. We need to have more discussions about how we make our forests healthier, how we make them more desirable, and how do we make them resilient so they can best cope with the conditions that are out of the control of the forest that are coming their way. And I would love to have that discussion and to move policy forward that does that. So I yield back. Thank you.
is there any further discussion? Mr. Lambert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll make this brief. This has been a very good discussion. Good points have been made on all the facets of this issue. I do find Mr. Westerman persuasive, so I'll be supporting his amendment. I do want to state, just for the record, that Colorado Springs Utilities has concerns about the water rights issue of the Camp Hale portion of this bill, Section 107, and they hope that those can be addressed as they go forward. And I would like to say that if there are forest fires, that does hurt water quality because flash floods become more of a problem after a forest fire and causes debris to be put into water storage lakes or reservoirs or rivers. And that's a real problem for water quality. So Colorado Springs has some concerns about this bill I hope can be addressed as we go forward. I'm going to see if the sponsor of the amendment has anything else he wishes to say, and I'd yield to him if he does. Otherwise, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. And is there any further discussion? Somebody needs to yield.
Can you yield?
Or used up.
Can you yield?
Ms. Holland?
Thank you, Chairman, and I yield my time to Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Representative Howland, and to Representative Lambrun's point, we're happy to work with you on that point. So and consult with the utility.
Yield back.
With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
And I yield.
Thank you. And any further discussion? I'm glad to see that this bill is transforming itself to a possible cure for the devastation of fires in our public lands. I appreciate that very much. And the anatomy discussion was good too. And but we now, if there's no further discussion, Mr. Go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just appreciate my friend, Mr. Lowenthal, so much, but when my friend, Mr. Westerman, was talking about the forest fires and underbrush that doesn't get cut and the fire lanes that aren't cut so that when lightning occurs, as it has for millennia, and a fire starts, we're able to put it out. And I yield to my friend's expertise on baseball, but in this area, we're not talking specifically about climate change. We're talking about very easy fixes to prevent and stop most fires, and that is simply managing the land. Whether the climate stays exactly the same, we have climate change 4 times a year, and I'm part of the woods, but or whether it's same or changes, still, there's an obligation to be responsible, manage the forests in such a way we don't destroy them. We've had some of those issues in the national forests. In my district, we've got a couple of national forests, and when the locals originally yielded land to the federal government for national forests, it was with the agreement that they'd get 25% of the proceeds of production of the timber. Unfortunately, we've never had any sequoias or redwoods. We're not talking anything like that. We're talking about trees that grow back every 20, 25 years, and they're one of our best renewable resources. But one of the side effects has been that by failing to manage the forest properly, not only we had disease and when the hurricanes have hit and we've lost timber, instead of allowing them to get rid of the dead wood within 90 days so that it could bring money in and prevent disease and prevent terrible effects on the rest of the forest, it sits there. It draws insects, draws disease, it adversely affects the forest. And if we were more responsible in the management area, it would be a win for everybody. So there's an obligation just to being good stewards of the land to manage it. And I think that's what my friend Mr. Westerman was talking about. But I appreciate the sensitivity to the term climate change, but here we're just talking about managing the forests. And by the way, example, rural Sabine County back in the late 80s, saw one year, it was pretty typical. Their 25% was around 1.6 million, which certainly helps the schools tremendously. And I don't know what it was last year, 2 years ago, it was $64,000. And it's really hard to keep a school going. You can't tax that huge area since it's national forests, and it's really put local people in a bind. Schools are suffering as a result. So I hope we'll get back to managing those forests more responsibly. And with that, I yield back.
Discussion on Mr. Westerman's amendment designated number 3. Hearing no further debate, all those in favor of Mr. Westerman's amendment indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed to the amendment indicate by saying no. No. The opinion of the chair is the no have it. The noes have it. Mr. Westerman, having requested a recorded vote, the vote pursuant to prior announcement will be postponed. We now move to HR 1225. Calling up the measure. The item is under consideration. It's HR 1225, sponsored by the gentleman from Utah, the ranking member, Mr. Bishop. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife, National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands, and the Subcommittee for Indigenous People of the United States be discharged from further consideration of the bill. And without objection, the bill will considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize the sponsor of the legislation, Representative Bishop from Utah. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. After our last hour and a half, I think I need a nap, actually. We have a huge backlog maintenance problem that developed over decades. It's nothing that didn't happen overnight. I think in the park system alone, it's $13 billion. If you include all public lands, including the forests, it's a $30 billion maintenance backlog. A couple of years ago, we started to try and deal with this when we passed the Centennial Fund. It was amazing how difficult that small step was to pass, but we got it done to involve the private sector in helping to solve some of these problems. This is an area that actually tries to take it to the next level, something supported by the administration. There is a Senate bill, not as good as ours, but that's basically a low bar in the first place. There are, it's one of those things where there are 290 co-sponsors of this bill, so 290 can't be all wrong. And the idea that if we're going to do this, let's take the unobligated federal energy revenues that comes from all form of energy on federal lands And anything that is unappropriated would then be added, the first $1.5 billion would be added to help fund this maintenance problem. So that programs going to states, GOMESA, LWCF, all of those would be funded first. If we increase any of those would be funded first. What is left over would be going to this program. It is not mandatory in the fact that we have to find a substitute. If there is nothing left over, it simply means that if there is nothing extra, then no money goes into this particular fund. But I think for the next 5 or 6 years, we're pretty secure there's going to be a plenty extra regardless of how much we put into all the other programs that are going to be in existence there. So it's one of those things that this is an old problem. This is a new wrinkle to an old solution. It is one of those things that will add to good government. It's a proper approach to it. I would urge you doing it. I'm sure that despite the number of co-sponsors, there will obviously be some opposition to it. I just remember, in the Constitutional Convention, there were 3 members that stayed the entire time and then voted against the Constitution. One was, of course, George Mason, because he didn't like what they did with Bill of Rights, even though it was a 10-0 vote against him. And the other was Edmund Randolph, who I think for political reasons voted no, but then in the critical moments in the Virginia ratifying convention, he switched over to support it, kind of spurred it on. The other was Elbridge Gerry, an interesting person in history, who gave a whole list of nitpicky reasons that compelled him to vote no. Reasons so simplistic and small today that no one ever remembers them or even lists them down. Some people told me, or it's been written, that it was part of his personality. He was the kind of person that if the Lord said the millennium will start on Tuesday, he would say, no, I got a watering turn, you got to wait till at least Wednesday to do it. Those type of situations notwithstanding, this is an approach that can solve a significant problem, and I'll yield back. Or I can keep talking, or I can yield back.
Yield back.
Thank you.
Let me recognize myself as, we all know the Department of Interior has a crippling maintenance backlog of over $16 billion. For years, we've been seeking to provide a dedicated solution to address this problem, and I appreciate very much the ranking member's effort to put forward a proposal that can and should and has received broad bipartisan support. Ensuring that our federal land managers have the necessary resources to protect and preserve our public land is really not a partisan issue, and the coalition behind and the members behind this legislation proves that. This bill does not change the fact that any long-term solution will require consistent and robust funding for our public lands. This bill also does not mitigate the need for other critical conservation programs such as the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Today, we can and must, and hopefully will take meaningful action to provide dedicated funding for ROPA and for Land and Water Conservation Fund. Addressing deferred maintenance and protecting ecologically important land is not a zero-sum game. Both proposals serve complementary ends. I look forward to working with Ranking Member Bishop and my colleagues across the aisle to make sure that our federal land managers have the funding and the resources they need to ensure that we aren't back here in 5 years trying to fix the same problem. I also appreciate the Ranking Member Bishop's willingness to work with us on an ANS that helps ensure project selection prioritizes long-term sustainability. This change will protect taxpayer dollars by making sure we are selecting and completing projects that are resilient to climate change and an impacted future. This is a good proposal, a good piece of legislation. I look forward to working with the ranking member to move this forward in a bipartisan fashion. With that, I yield back the remainder of my time and prepared to recognize anyone else who wishes to comment on the legislation. Mr. Graves, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we had a lengthy markup in this committee last week.
Well, the gentleman was suspended. It's just general debate. It's general debate. Thank you, Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, last week we had a lengthy markup in this committee, and we had a lengthy markup, and certainly we contributed to that. The reason we did it is because the legislation that was put forth, in my opinion, and the people that we're here to represent, this legislation, the legislation last week, took money that was produced off the coast of Louisiana primarily and other states, and it took it and it put it to the benefit of other states and other communities. Now, if the money wasn't needed in the vicinity of Louisiana, or if there was not other policy parity, I wouldn't have done it. I don't agree with the policy, and I don't agree with the policy today. Let me go back and see if I can explain this. Right now, under federal law, if a state produces, if there's energy produced within a state on federal lands wholly owned by the federal government, that state gets 50% of the money. They get 50% of the money, and they can do whatever they want with it. They can do whatever they want. There are no restrictions, none. They don't have to mitigate impacts from the energy production. They can do whatever they want. An additional 40% of the money goes into what's called the Reclamation Fund. It funds water projects in, 16 western states, I believe, just in those states. All right, so up to 90% of the money. The 50% mandatory spending goes to that states, and then the other 40% goes to the Reclamation Fund, only 10% goes to the Treasury. In the case of our offshore energy production, what happens is the states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas, we get 37.5% of energy production revenue shared with us, but it's just from production that was at least or issued after December of 2006. So when you crunch the numbers last year, for example, or year before last, I think it was year before last, it comes out to 0.4% revenue sharing, 0.4, not the 50% the other states are getting. Now, let me put that in perspective. The states of Wyoming and New Mexico together get over $1 billion a year, over $1 billion. We received, in recent years, $6 million. We received a few $100,000 for several years, and then we hit a high water mark this year, and I'm doing it from memory, so I'm going to be off a little bit. I think it was $80 million, $84 million. We have a $60 to $70 billion coastal restoration problem. Unlike the onshore energy production where the money just goes to the state coffers and they add it to everything else and do whatever they want, we have agreed to commit every penny of the money to the restoration of our coastal ecosystem. I took my good friend, Mr. Lowenthal, and I want to thank you again for coming down to see what that means. This is our homes, our businesses, our communities, our ecosystem disappearing. 2,000 square miles. It's equivalent to the state of Rhode Island disappearing. All I'm asking for, to my environmentalist friends, all I'm asking for is to give us some equal treatment, some parity, to where we're not getting 0.4%, to where we can get more of the revenue, and we will agree, again, to invest every penny of it, in ecological restoration and environmental projects. Now, what this bill does, just like the ones last week, it takes the money to where we can't do that. So I'm not asking to just dump it in state coffers and do whatever we want with it. I'm asking for it to be for the same parity, the same policy for onshore production, and we will agree to commit it to ecological restoration. So the bill last week, the bill this week just continues to take the money. And I want to make clear, no, this is not in excess of baseline. It doesn't say that. That's not what it says. This is taking the money and it's diverting it. I don't agree with this policy. And what happens by not making these investments on the front end, as we've seen, Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, Michael, Florence, the devastation by the lack of resilient investments, sustainable investments in this community, it costs taxpayers more money. So here we are last week. We have, what is it, a $13 billion maintenance backlog in our federal parks and national wildlife refuges and others? $13 billion? Last week, we just did mandatory spending to acquire tens of billions of dollars and more without having a sustainable maintenance plan. And so this bill provides $6 billion in mandatory spending on top of the tens of billions from last year. $6.5 billion. So I think this bill is flawed. We're going to do a number of amendments to help point out some of that and help to make it better policy. And I look forward to the debate on these amendments. Yield back.
Mr. Chairman. Chairman Graham at the end. May I be recognized? Thank you. I would be remiss if I did not echo the sentiments of my colleague from Louisiana, and I just want to say I won't belabor the point because it's all been said. It's been heard by this committee, and I hope you understand our position on this. I echo everything he said and just add, if there's any misunderstanding about this, about the motivation, about the need, Louisiana is not being greedy, we are needy, okay? Yes, there are needs, there's a backlog of park maintenance and all these other problems, we acknowledge that. But we have a crisis on the Gulf Coast, and Louisiana in particular. We have 40% of the country's wetlands in Louisiana and 90% of the marsh erosion. We're losing the equivalent, it's been said in here more times than we can count, the equivalent of a football field an hour. We lost a football field and a half in the time that we've been sitting here. It's the equivalent of 75 square kilometers every year. This is a crisis. We need the funds so that we can invest them appropriately and save this critical wetland because it is essential. This land, this area, these people are essential to the production of oil and gas and the economy of the United States. So we're not saying this is an investment just for Louisiana. It's an investment for all of us, every single one of your districts in every state in this country. And the idea that we would just want the fair share is not is not inappropriate. It's not out of line, and it's something that I hope everyone would heed. And so I'll yield to gentleman from Louisiana.
Very quickly, Mr. Chairman, I want to make note that last Congress, when this issue came up, we did this bill. And we also did a bill to dedicate funds to the Land and Water Conservation Fund. But you know what? That agreement, we had a bipartisan agreement to do a third bill. It was a bill that Mr. Johnson and I worked on that shared revenues with the state of Louisiana. And we committed all of the money to the coast. So here we are this year. We're doing the Land and Water Conservation Fund bill. We're doing the maintenance bill. And our bill has been jettisoned. That was part of the agreement last year. And our bill has been jettisoned. And so, for those of you that weren't here last year, weren't aware of the agreement, the bill passed out of this committee by voice vote. That's all we're asking for. We're asking for this to be part of the discussion. We're asking to have some degree of parity with what happens with the onshore minimum revenues for production on federal lands. And I yield back to the gentleman from Louisiana.
I think that's well said. We come to this committee, we come to these negotiations in good faith. We come with the expectation that these needs, the urgency of this hour will be recognized, and repeatedly we're disappointed. And I don't blame anybody individually. I just blame this process, and I hope that these urgent needs will be recognized and given the due attention.
The gentleman yield just for a question.
I'll be happy to yield. Yes.
To yourself or your colleague from Louisiana.
Sure.
The legislation has been jettisoned. Has legislation been filed relative to the discussion that Mr. Graves is having?
Yield to Mr. Graves.
Mr. Chairman, we have repeatedly tried to engage to talk about, because we didn't want to file the bill until we had some type of agreement or discussion like we did last Congress. And so we have tried to do it, and we have been repeatedly told that there's no negotiating on this. We've even had third parties from environmental community and others approach the committee and discuss this, and they've been told the same thing.
So there's no legislation per se?
Mr. Chairman, I can take the bill that we introduced last year. I can introduce it today if you'd like, if that's what you'd like to do. But
I'm just saying, if that's the frame of reference for the discussion, that would be kind of interesting. And then so far as, I file legislation all the time, and
Mr. Chairman, out of respect to the...
I don't have a guarantee that at the end of the day it's going to pass.
That's right. And out of respect to the committee, Mr. Chairman, the idea is that we would have a discussion out of deference to the committee's leadership and introduce legislation that folks had agreed upon rather than doing a unilateral bill. If you're still in agreement with the legislation we did the last Congress that passed out of this committee by voice vote, then I think, Mr. Johnson, I would be happy to reintroduce that this year. We could put it on the markup agenda by UC today.
We'd be happy to do that, but as reclaim my time, as Mr. Graves is explaining, we were trying to do this in the appropriate manner. We didn't want to do this unilaterally. We wanted to do it with agreement from everyone because we feel like that's the most appropriate way. It's not a messaging bill. It's not just to make a statement. We need this to be done, and so we want to introduce legislation that can pass, and that's why it's so essential. I yield back.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Gentleman yields back. And does any other member wish to be recognized on the legislation before we go to amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Gonzalez-Colon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank leadership of the committee for bringing this bill to discussion today. This bipartisan bill to restore parks and public lands, introduced by our Republican leader, Bishop, which I'm a proud co-sponsor, I think it's vital to be included. But at the same time, I heard my colleagues from Johnson and Graves talking about the needs of Louisiana, and I can't agree more. So I look forward to see or be a co-sponsor of that legislation as well. But talking about this bill, parks and public lands are vital, not just to the rest of the nation, but in Puerto Rico as well. Our tourism and recreation economy thrives because of this. The San Juan National Historic Site, a World Heritage Site that includes important 16th century fortifications from the Spanish colonial era, generates more than $100 million in economic activity for the island each year. But in 2016, more than 1.4 million people visited the park, spurring more than 85 in visitor spending. The 5 national wildlife refuges in Puerto Rico are also important economic engines for our communities. According to the Fish and Wildlife Service, nearly 338,000 visitors had a quality outdoor experience at one of the island's refuges last year. However, these benefits are threatened if we fail to address the deferred maintenance backlog, which totals over $40.1 million just in the San Juan National Historic Site, and over $7.2 million across the Puerto Rico National Wildlife Refuges. H.R. 1225 offers a sensible solution for this problem by establishing the National Park and Public Lands Restoration Funds, providing funding for the high-priority deferred maintenance need that support critical infrastructure and visitor services at our national parks across the nation, wildlife refuges and other public lands. This bill has 290 co-sponsors in a bipartisan way, and is the only bill in our jurisdiction that has garnered support from more than half of the House members. It also has a broad support in the Senate. I think we need to fix our parks for future generations, and I commend Congressman Bishop for his leadership working this legislation, not just now, but during the last Congress as well, on vital issue, and strongly urge to move forward this and restore parks and Public Lands Act. With that, I'll yield back.
Recognized before we go to amendments. Mr. Westerman, I'm sorry, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm a co-sponsor of this bill, but I was reluctant for a long time to co-sponsor the bill, mainly because of the issues my colleagues from Louisiana have brought up. It seems like the right thing to do, that we would try to protect the lands in Louisiana with monies from the Land and Water Conservation Fund. That being said, those lands aren't being protected now. They're not getting any funding now, but this bill does move the ball forward to address a concern that I think we all have, and that's the infrastructure and maintenance backlog on all of our public lands. So although this bill is a good bill, I wouldn't call it a great bill, because we've neglected these issues in Louisiana. And I hope that as we move forward, we can bring up legislation that would look at the wetlands and the coastal areas in Louisiana, again, where all of these funds are being generated, that would be addressing issues all across the country. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else want to be recognized?
I thought he was doing his amendment.
Are you looking for recognition for amendments, or?
No, I'm beginning the process right now. Thank you. There's no further debate on the legislation. We'll begin the amendment process. Without objection, ANS offered by myself is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Representative Westerman, you have the first amendment, number 1. You're recognized for 5 minutes to support that amendment. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you and the ranking member working with us on this amendment. Not only was Louisiana left out of the conversation, but when we look at recreation on federal lands, there was a gaping hole in this bill on an area that was left out, and that's the U.S. Forest Service. We have a large backlog on the Forest Service. If we look at the amount of land the Forest Service manages, it's twice the amount of land of the National Park Service, which would receive 80% of the funding in this bill. And if you look at the number of recreational visits, and this is Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, BLM, in all the federal lands, 620 million recreation visits per year. The Forest Service accounts for about 24% of those visits. So I don't understand why we didn't include maintenance and backlog on the Forest Service, because it's such a critical part to recreation and keeping our wildlands wild. And I think it should be included as part of this bill. So that's why I proposed this amendment, which would put the Forest Service in the mix to receive some of the funding so that we could keep it well maintained and give people opportunities to recreate on those lands. And a small consolation to our friends from Louisiana, they do have national forest in Louisiana, and it would mean a little bit more of this funding got directed back to Louisiana if we could include the Forest Service. That being said, I would agree to withdraw my amendment, and hopefully we can work on a solution to include the Forest Service when the bill gets to the floor.
Would yield?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Your amendment to add the Forest Service to the list of land management agencies that would be included in the legislation at I think a 10% share and reducing funding allocation for parks and wild refuge by 5% each. Although the Forest Service has maintenance backlog challenges, this bill has been drafted to focus on DOI's crippling the maintenance backlog of 16 to 18 billion. But your point is well taken. The committee is open to including other agencies in these conversations and that are ongoing, but including the amendment as drafted would add, I think, additional complications that might slow or hurt the path of the bill forward. I support your intent, sir, and would be happy to work with you to ensure Forest Service funding backlog gets due consideration as this proposal moves forward, but can't support the amendment at this time, but you have my commitment to work on addressing the issue that you brought up.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Ditto. We'll try and add it on the floor.
Appreciate that. And again, I would withdraw my amendment then with that commitment to work on it on the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Gentleman withdraws. Representative Graves, you have the next amendment identified as number 1. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, before we do this amendment, I'd like to ask the bill sponsor a simple question. Section 8G of the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act establishes a boundary between, 3 miles seaward of state waters where it shares 27% of the royalties in that area. Under the base text of the bill, would these dollars and would those revenues be jeopardized? Yield to the gentleman. That would be oil, gas, and alternative energy as well, wind energy, for example. Those would not be subjected to sharing under this legislation or diverted in any way?
No, it's only unappropriated federal revenue.
I'm sorry?
No, it's only unappropriated federal revenue, so it's not covered.
Appropriated federal revenue. I'm going to take the no. I'm not sure I understood the second part. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, with the understanding that it's the sponsor's intent to not subject Section 8G, that portion that was established by the Congress decades ago, that portion in sharing to states, I will withdraw amendment number 1.
The gentleman withdraws the amendment. We now move to this now. We move to amendment number 2. Mr. Graves, you have the next amendments, and you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, what this amendment does, so as we know, under the base text of this bill, approximately $6.5 billion will be appropriated in mandatory spending over the next 5 years to address backlog maintenance on federal lands. There's no requirement that we look at the cost effectiveness of those investments. I and my friend from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, noted that we have a coastal crisis in Louisiana. Let's also keep in mind that what this base bill does is it takes backlog maintenance and it puts it before every single other thing in the appropriations process. Mr. Chairman, as you well know, we could simply appropriate more money through the regular appropriations bill for the Department of Interior, and as my friend from Arkansas just noted, the Department of Agriculture through the Forest Service. We could appropriate more funds through the appropriations process where we can determine what is the highest priority. What this bill does is it says that backlog maintenance on federal lands is more important than veterans benefits. It's more important than programs for our seniors. It's more important than environmental programs. It's more important than early education for children. It's more important than everything. It puts it at the front of the line by establishing mandatory spending. And so this is a simple good government amendment that just says that in order for these projects to be funded, it doesn't defund the bill, it doesn't divert the funds, it just says in order for these maintenance projects to be funded, we've got to ensure that there's at least a 2-to-1 cost to benefit ratio. As you know, across government, Corps of Engineer projects and transportation projects and many others, there's some type of economic calculation that's required before federal dollars are expended, and this simply applies that same approach to this mandatory spending bill that takes $6.5 billion over the next 5 years and puts it in front of every other government program. I yield back.
Any further discussion on the gentleman's amendment?
Yeah, may I?
Mr. Bishop.
Let me try and expedite the process as best we can here, and let me talk about all of the Graves amendments in one fell swoop. The first one that you just withdrew, I don't think was necessary, but it was also positive. I would have accepted that one gladly because it simply specified what we are trying to do. Now, amendment number 3 and 9, I think should be non-germane under Rule X, but since the parliamentarians have not ruled on that, I do believe both of those would have a sequential referral problem, and so I oppose those at the same time. The rest of them, I'm sorry, they simply change the focus and the attempt of what we are trying to do with this bill. So except for number 1, if you want to rebring that, I object to all of those that are here, and then I won't take the time on them individually. I yield back.
The chair concurs with the ranking member, and we move, the gentleman has yielded back on amendment number 2. If there's no further debate on the question, all those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed indicate by saying no. No. The opinion of chairs, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Gentleman has requested a recorded vote, and that is postponed pursuant to prior announcement. Representative Graves, you have the next amendment, number 3.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. This is amendment number 3. And so what this would do is it would simply expand the use of funds to include projects for infrastructure projects, including natural infrastructure, coastal resiliency, hurricane protection, flood prevention, protection and ecological restoration projects in states where these revenues are actually generated. And of course, the states would be determined based upon the Convention of Law of the Sea that would extend the seaward lateral boundaries of those states to determine which states actually produce these revenues. So once again, it would ensure that the dollars are invested back in the states where the revenue is generated. This is a similar approach to how the Minimum Leasing Act treats revenues from onshore federal production of mineral revenues. And Mr. Chairman, I want to remind you, this is to ensure the resiliency of states like Texas that was just pounded by Hurricane Harvey 2 years ago, and other states that have experienced significant natural disasters, to ensure that these states are actually resilient, prepared for the future. And I urge adoption of the amendment number 3. Yield back, yes, sir, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment by Representative Graves designated as number 3. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The noes have it, and in the opinion of the chair, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Mr. Graves requested a recorded vote and postponed as pursuant to prior instructions. Mr. Graves, you have the next amendment, number 4.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amendment number 4, as I noted, what this does is it takes every other potential federal government responsibility and it puts this in front of it. It says that the maintenance of our national forest and the maintenance of our national parks and our BLM lands, that this is the highest priority in effect within the federal government. It puts it above all of these other programs, Mr. Chairman, like, for example, if our veterans need additional benefits or financial assistance, if there are environmental protection programs, if there are roads in our districts or communities that need to be constructed. It says that this is more important. And so something that I know all of us here share is the recovery from the awful disasters that we've had in 2017, 2018, and prospective disasters this year. I mentioned earlier we had devastating impacts of Hurricane Harvey in Texas, Hurricane Irma in the Caribbean, Hurricane Maria in the Caribbean and in Florida, Hurricane Michael and Florence along our East Coast in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Devastating consequences from these hurricanes. There's been much debate in this Congress about ensuring that these communities are fully recovered. Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Florida, Texas, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, ensuring that these communities are recovered. So what this would do is this amendment simply says that this $6.5 billion mandatory spending program can move forward, but once it is certified that we have fully recovered and we have ample resources for the devastation in the communities that were impacted, the disaster victims impacted by Hurricanes Harvey, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Florence, the wildfires in California. I know my friends from California are concerned about the recovery of their communities in California, and of course the 2019 floods or disasters that will occur this year. So it doesn't stop it from happening. It simply says that it doesn't happen if we have not been able to confirm that those disasters or communities have been recovered or restored. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Graves, gentleman yields back. Any further discussion or debate? Hearing none, the question is on the amendment offered by Representative Graves, designated as number 4. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed, no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Gentleman asked for a recorded vote, postponed based on prior announcement. Representative Graves, you're again recognized for your amendment number 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is amendment number 5, and what this would do is amendment number 5 simply says that it largely does what the bill sponsor communicated earlier. The bill sponsor indicated that this was revenue in excess of baseline projections. So if we have a Congressional Budget Office baseline projection, for example, and if it said in FY20 that we're going to get $1 billion from the revenue from energy production, then the only way that revenue would go into the fund is if revenues are generated in excess of $1 billion. If we have $1.1 billion, in that scenario, $100 million would go into the fund for maintenance. So what this does is this simply says, it doesn't stop the bill from happening, but it simply complies with with this description that this is only for revenues in excess of baseline projections. And so amendment number 2, it simply says, only when revenues from oil, gas, coal, or alternative or renewable energy development on federal lands and waters is in excess of the baseline 10-year projections of the Congressional Budget Office for such fiscal year. I think this is a common sense amendment that ensures that, that we're not necessarily taking funds from other priority programs, and I think more responsible budgeting, although I still would have problems with this. I think it does put this bill in a better posture, and I urge adoption of the amendment.
Gentleman yields back.
Yield back, yes, sir.
Thank you. Any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment offered by Representative Graves, number 5. Please, those in favor indicate by saying aye. Those opposed indicate by saying no. The opinion of the chair is the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Representative Graves, you have the next amendment, number 6. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, amendment number 6, what this does is it doesn't prevent the Congress from doing what the bill's sponsor desires to do, what the goal is here. The goal is to address backlog park maintenance. Let me say it again. What this bill does is it circumvents the Appropriations Committee. It is determining that backlog park maintenance is more important than flood protection projects in your community. It's more important than climate change research and development. It's more important than energy technology programs. It's more important than building that additional bridge or road in your congressional district. It's more important than restoring the environment. It takes all of these other programs and it puts them after. It says that we're first, we're most important. It's the most important thing that this government is doing, this government's job or responsibility. So what this does is it simply says that the authorization for $1.3 billion per year is still there. The authorization can still happen, but it's not a mandatory appropriation. So as we go through our appropriations process, Mr. Chairman, we'll have the ability as a Congress to determine which priority is highest, which one is most important to the constituents that we're representing. I think that this amendment certainly is a good government. It is a responsible budgeting amendment as opposed to continuing to put billions and billions of dollars into mandatory spending, contributing to our deficit, contributing to our debt, contributing to the challenges that our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren are going to be experiencing because of irresponsible budgeting. I remind you, Mr. Chairman, that the national debt right now is in excess of $20 trillion, in excess of $20 trillion. This underlying bill will contribute to that. I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment offered by Representative Graves, number 6. Please indicate those in favor by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Recorded vote, please, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, the gentleman asked for a recorded vote. The vote is postponed pursuant to a prior announcement. Representative Graves, you have the next amendment, number 7. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amendment number 7 points out some of the other potential priorities that may be out there, that this underlying bill, this base bill, is effectively putting toward the end of the line. So an example of that is wildlife habitat. So what this does is this takes 80% of the funds that are deposited in the fund, and I'll remind you that's $1.3 billion annually, and it makes those funds available to the states of Utah, Wyoming, Montana, Oregon, Colorado, and Idaho. Let me try that again. Idaho, to implement state wildlife action plans that protects, restores, and improves greater sage grouse habitat. I think that members of this committee remember all of the time that we spent the last Congress and the previous Congress discussing the importance of this issue, the importance of states managing wildlife habitat, the role of the states versus the federal government in addressing endangered species and species habitat, and in many cases, Mr. Chairman, looking at the greater efficacy of investment by states rather than the federal government. And so this would dedicate 80% of the funds that are deposited annually, I remind you, $1.3 billion each year for the next 5 years, and would allow the states of Utah, Wyoming, Montana, Oregon, Colorado, and Idaho to use those funds to implement state wildlife action plans to address greater sage grouse habitat and help to prevent some of the conflicts that we've seen in recent years. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Graves, gentleman yields back. Any further discussion? Mr. Van Drew.
Just very briefly, I think there are many states that are concerned with wildlife habitat and managing it. And while those are important states, there are many others. So I just find a deficiency in that amendment just by that factor alone.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yield back.
Yield back? Thank you. Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment offered by Representative Graves, number 7. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed indicate by saying no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Representative Graves, you have the next amendment, number 8.
Mr. Chairman, amendment number 8 is a very simple amendment that simply has a signage requirement that just requires that projects that are funded under this program, that it makes note that the project is carried out using funds from energy development. Just drawing the connectivity, we have many people here that often like to spend the money from energy production, as we've seen last week and this week. This has got to be a record that just in the last 2 weeks out of this committee, we're going to be reporting bills that are providing mandatory spending for tens of billions of dollars in taxpayer funds. This really is incredible. I've never seen anything like this. So it simply provides connectivity. Mr. Chairman, to respond to my friend from New Jersey in the last amendment, amendment number 7. Look, I'd be happy to dedicate these funds to other states' wildlife programs as well. If my friend would like to work with me on that, I'd be happy that we could draft an amendment right now. We could file another amendment that would dedicate it to wildlife programs in other states. If that's something that gentleman from New Jersey would like to work with me on, I'm happy to yield time if you'd like to discuss that and give me an amen or something. Be happy. No, I'm getting a thumbs down. All right. Well, you're still on the Christmas card list, I promise. So I'll yield to you.
At least I got you recognizing there are other states.
Absolutely. In fact, I missed Mr. Van Drew, I've made mention to other states. I've been trying to share the wealth throughout this process, including sharing the wealth with all 50 states, with priorities in foreign aid and other things that people may think are important, because what this bill does is it actually is going to limit the expenditure of funds just to a handful of states that actually have the national parks, that have the wildlife refuges, that have the BLM land, and those states that don't will not be receiving any of these revenues. And so, in fact, I think I read somewhere that $1 billion in funds were going to go to projects in California alone. The irony of which is that California has actually opposed much of this very same energy production, which perhaps that puts this whole bill in perspective as to why some folks are supporting it and some folks aren't. But with that, Mr. Chairman, this is simply a signage amendment. I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Thank you very much for yielding. And is there any further discussion of the amendment?
What is it?
If there isn't, hearing no debate, the question is on the amendment offered by Congressman Graves, designated number 8. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, asks for a recorded vote.
Gentleman asks for a recorded vote.
Actually, I take it back. Mr. Chairman, on that one, I won't. Mr. Chairman, I rescind the request for a recorded vote.
Gentlemen,
Just the signage one, I don't think it's a big deal.
Representative Graves, you have the next amendment, number 9. You're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gonna read back through my amendment, remember what I'm doing here. Mr. Chairman, this is amendment number 9, and what this says is this largely reflects the legislation that I referenced in the opening statement that would deposit 50% of revenues from energy development and from oil, gas, coal, renewables, whichever type of energy is your favorite, and would deposit it into a fund, and then it would distribute the dollars back to those states where the production occurs, and it would limit the use of funds for important uses like restoration and protection of wildlife habitat, ecosystem, fisheries programs, marine and wildlife habitats, beaches, coastal wetlands, and others, mitigation for damage to fish and wildlife and natural resources, infrastructure projects benefiting the ecological resources, and coastal and inland flood protection type projects. This also importantly, Mr. Chairman, would allow states to make investments in mine reclamation projects as well, which I know is important to some members of this committee. So this is similar to parity under the Mineral Leasing Act. It would ensure that funds are going back to the states where the production actually occurs. I think that the uses of funds are much more restrictive than under the Mineral Leasing Act, which I hope my environmental friends would appreciate, that we're spending these dollars on environmental restoration, environmental projects, and on mine reclamation type projects. And so, Mr. Chairman, I urge adoption of this fantastic policy and look forward to hearing your concurrence. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion of the amendment? Hearing no debate. The question is on the amendment offered by Representative Graves, number 9. All those in favor, please say aye. All those opposed, say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The gentleman has asked for a recorded vote, postponed as per the prior announcement. Representative Graves, you have the next amendment, number 10.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to remind members that when we have another disaster, that folks are going to have to explain why they believe that rebuilding a fence in a national park was more important than improving the resiliency of a community, than improving the resiliency of an ecosystem. Why folks thought it was more important to go out there and go perhaps repave a road on a piece of BLM property, as opposed to actually improving the sustainability or resilience of our communities. This same mistake, Mr. Chairman, was made by this Congress decades ago. Hurricane Katrina alone, we lost about 1,500 people, Americans. 1,500 Americans died. They lost their life because of this Congress's inability to fund projects and ensure that we had resiliency programs that had proper development and delivery mechanisms. So, Mr. Chairman, I think it's really important to keep that in mind as we move forward. This next amendment sort of gives folks an opportunity to do that. What it does is it says that if we're making these investments in maintenance, perhaps that's going to increase the number of visitors that come to our national parks, which will increase the fees or the income coming to these parks. Because I remind you, Mr. Chairman, that all of these parks, these wildlife refuges, they have entrance fees. They're allowed to have entrance fees. So they're allowed to have a funding mechanism to actually make them sustainable, to actually address the maintenance issues, to address operations issues. And so there already is a funding stream that's there. The appropriations process is allowed to supplement that. And so what this amendment does, it says that if we have increased funds that are coming into the national parks, then we can therefore reduce that mandatory spending of $6.5 billion in taxpayer funds that are being diverted under this legislation and put in front of the line before veterans benefits, before road projects, before flood protection projects, community resilience projects, ecological restoration projects, and other things that apparently members of this committee believe hold a second fiddle or are less important than rebuilding fences in our national parks. And perhaps one of my favorite examples was the Delaware Gap bathroom, where I think it was a no plumbing bathroom in Delaware Gap that costs like $500,000. Those types of projects, and this committee earlier rejected our amendment by voice vote anyway, that would require at least the cost to benefit ratio to ensure that this $6.5 billion in taxpayer funds is being spent on projects that actually matter, that actually have a return on investment for taxpayers. And so this would simply allow for some type of offset based on the increase in collections from entrance fees. I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Anyone wish to be recognized on the amendment? If not, hearing no debate, the question is on the amendment offered by Representative Graves, number 10. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed indicate by saying no. No. The opinion of chairs, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to welcome Mr.
Graves,
Galea. Oh, I'm sorry.
Mr. Graves, you've filed an additional 10 amendments designated as 11 through 20. We're going to pass out those amendments now.
Thank you.
And you are recognized on amendment number 11.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, amendment number 11, what this would do is this would simply allow for those states that support energy production to be able to benefit. I remind you, Mr. Chairman, that under the Mineral Leasing Act and many other programs, that states get to share in the revenue. They get to share in those revenues as those revenues become available.
What?
As they're generated from energy production. We talked last week a good bit about states that are trying to have their cake and eat it too. They want to both reject opportunities to develop our public, our nation's resources. They want to reject those, but they also want to benefit financially from them. And so what this would do is it would say that states that have rejected energy development or mineral development or resource development in their states, they wouldn't be able to benefit from the maintenance projects. This is similar to the Mineral Leasing Act. I haven't heard a single member in this committee object to the Mineral Leasing Act, try and amend the Mineral Leasing Act revenue sharing program. Not just do those states get 50% of the revenue, an additional 40% goes into the reclamation fund for water projects, often in those same states. So, Mr. Chairman, this would ensure that the states that are supporting energy production would be benefiting from the revenue, which is consistent with the policy under the Mineral Leasing Act and many other revenue sharing acts. I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on number identified as number 11? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment offered by Representative Graves, designated as number 11. All those in favor of the amendment indicate by saying aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The gentleman has asked for a recorded vote, postponed as per prior announcement. Representative Graves, you have amendment number 12. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amendment number 12, I've made several references today to the Mineral Leasing Act, the act that shares revenues from states that produce, it's not states. When the federal government produces energy on lands that the federal government owns, the state gets 50%, or in some cases, my friend from Alaska, they get 90%. That's right, I'm sorry, 48%, thank you. But don't worry, we have an amendment to fix that too. So, Mr. Chairman, let me remind folks here that when states get revenue sharing from onshore production on federal lands, they get the money and they don't have to do anything with it. They can do whatever they want with it. They can do. There's no restrictions on the funds under federal law. They can do whatever they want with it. It's revenue sharing. And so And so the states could actually take that very revenue and they could use it to address backlog parks maintenance, if that's what their priority is. Let them do it. And so what this says, it says that any state has received $30 million, in excess of $30 million in revenue, in funds that aren't being used to mitigate impacts from Mineral Leasing Act activities, that they're not eligible for operations and maintenance on their parks or federal lands because they have $30 million or more that they could use to address it themselves. So I think this is a simple, good government amendment. I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment offered by Representative Graves, designated as number 12. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed indicate by saying no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
I'm going to give you a pass on that one.
Appreciate it, Mr. Graves.
You bet. You
Any
bet.
small favor is very much appreciated.
You bet, Mr. Chairman. I won't do anything to affect our friendship.
No. Representative Graves, you're recognized for your next amendment, number 13.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Number 13, this amendment, some members of this committee may remember from last Congress. I made mention a little while ago the Delaware Gap bathroom, a pretty famous project that was carried out, I believe, by the National Park Service. Incredibly excessive cost for using taxpayer funds. And so, Mr. Chairman, what this would do, it doesn't stop the bill from moving forward. It just ensures that we're being good stewards of taxpayer funds. It ensures that that projects that are carried out are not carried out on projects that cost in excess of $250 a square foot for construction. Mr. Chairman, you're aware of the cost of maintenance and construction activities. Certainly, $250 per square foot for construction is pretty high. This would apply to restrooms, to lodges, visitor centers, interpretive centers, concessions, administrative offices, housing type projects, and just ensuring that we're being good stewards of taxpayer dollars and that we're not wasting these funds on projects that are excessive, don't have merit, like we've seen in many instances with projects in the past. So with that, I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion? Hearing no further debate, the question is the amendment offered by Representative Graves, designated as number 13. All those in favor of the amendment indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed indicate by saying no. No. The opinion of the chair is the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Gentleman has requested a recorded vote, postponed as pursuant to prior announcement. Representative Graves, your next amendment, number 14.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amendment number 14 simply, I think, advances the intent of this legislation. The intent of the legislation is ensuring that the federal assets, the assets that the public owns in terms of our national park lands, our BLM lands, our wildlife refuges, it's designed to ensure that these are properly operated and maintained, right? Well, Mr. Chairman, I want to remind you that another agency that has substantial land holdings is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and those are recreational, managed for recreational purposes in many cases. And so what this does is this reduces, as I recall, the 80% under the base text that goes to the National Park Service, reduces that to 70%, and then takes that incremental 10% and dedicates it to operations and maintenance on Corps of Engineer lands that are managed for recreational purposes as well. Tens of thousands of acres in holding that the federal government has through the Corps of Engineers. Again, I think that visitors to these lands would not recognize any difference between that land and a park or a wildlife refuge or BLM land or something along those lines. And so I'm not sure why this bill doesn't cover that important priority as well. If these other uses are priorities, then why not also include recreational lands owned or operated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So, Mr. Chairman, I think this is a good policy. It does advance the sponsor's objectives of this bill, and I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields. Seeing no and hearing no further debate, the question is the amendment offered by Representative Graves, number 14. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed indicate by saying no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Representative Graves, you're recognized for your next amendment, number 15.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, what this amendment does is this amendment, so this is all about maintenance of our natural resources, restoration of our natural resources, our parks and wildlife refuges, our BLM lands, our lands that are owned by the federal government for the purpose of allowing folks to recreate, allowing folks to enjoy the natural resources, and importantly, Mr. Chairman, I think that the reason that these lands were acquired is because we're trying to protect the ecological productivity or the ecological function of these properties. Well, Mr. Chairman, if we're going to be able to sustain the Land and Water Conservation Fund and under the legislation this committee reported just last week, if we're able to sustain the $900 million per year that is taken from offshore energy revenues and put into this fund, mandatory spending each year, spent, not just authorized, spent, because we authorized it earlier this year, another opportunity where much of the coastal America's needs were rejected. Then we need to ensure that the funding stream is actually sustainable. So what this amendment does is it says that before we go and put $1.3 billion in this fund every year, that we first make sure that the very area where these funds are derived is sustainable, that this revenue stream is sustainable. And so what this does is it says that if it's determined that it's not sustainable, then the funds are actually going to go to restore or improve the resilience of these very areas that generate this revenue. Mr. Chairman, I want to remind you, you look at the 6 states that produce offshore energy, Alaska and California and Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama. Over 80% of all of that revenue, 80% of all that production occurs off the state of Louisiana. And if it's unsustainable because we've lost 2,000 square miles, then we've got to do something about that because it makes this whole revenue stream unsustainable. The revenue stream, not just for Land and Water Conservation Fund, not just for the Historic Preservation Fund, another fund that gets revenue out of here, not just for, as we have under this legislation, the National Parks and Wildlife Refuges. Mr. Chairman, do you realize that in 2008, over $14 billion was generated from offshore energy revenues, $14 billion. This was one of the largest revenue streams outside of taxes for our entire government. And so what this bill does is it ensures that revenue stream is a sustainable revenue stream, that we can continue generating these dollars so we can continue to invest in our parks and wildlife refuges and LWCF and Historic Preservation Fund and all these other priorities that members of this committee apparently uphold before anything else. So this would just ensure that the revenue stream is sustainable, ensure that we continue to have the revenue stream for future years, so we can continue doing projects and priorities like apparently members of this committee think is more important than all the other priorities within the federal government. More important than building roads, more important than building bridges in their district, more important than building flood protection and making their communities resilient, more important than addressing adapting to climate change, as I often hear my friends talk about, more important than early childhood education, more important than veterans benefits, more important than environmental programs, more important than anything, apparently, is what my friends in this committee think. And so this just ensures that the revenue stream is sustainable, that we can keep funding those things that you all think are more important than everything else. So I urge adoption of the amendment, and we'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion? If there's hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment offered by Representative Graves, number 15. All those in favor of the amendment indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed indicate no. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
I think I'm asked for recorded on that one.
Excuse me? Mr. Graves, did he ask for a recorded vote? Mr. Graves, you requested a recorded vote on the last one?
On number 15, yes, sir, please.
The vote will be postponed. Representative Graves, you're recognized for amendment number 16.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is amendment number 16, and what this would do, as I've been corrected in this committee, I think twice in 2 weeks, I keep referring to one half of the funds from Mineral Leasing Act production on federal lands going to the states. And while 50% of the funds are diverted, back in, I believe it was 2014, 2% of the funds began being retained by the federal agencies for administering this program. And so what this would do is it would, let me say it again, it would not undermine the objectives of the bill. What it would do is it would simply allow for that 2% to be restored. It would take a very small portion of these revenues, of the $1.3 billion annually, and it would allow for those states to recoup that 2% that they've lost. These same western states that collect, as I said before, New Mexico and Wyoming, over $1 billion annually. It would allow this 2% to be restored. This would be retroactive back to the loss in revenue, the 2% back to 2014, and ensure that that full 50% of revenues can be collected and maintained by those states that host such energy production within the four corners of those states' boundaries. I know this is a priority for many members of this committee. I've heard it discussed many times in here, and certainly want to give those members an opportunity to get their full 50% and ensure that they aren't losing those revenues as they have lost since 2014. And perhaps, Mr. Chairman, with that 2% restored, maybe those states would determine that they would use those dollars and actually invest part of it in park maintenance or in federal land maintenance within their state. So I urge adoption of this important amendment and yield back.
Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Janey, you're recognized.
Thank you. I'd like to speak in support of Mr. Graves' amendment. It's crucially important that we return to the structure that was provided by law. States ought to be able to recoup 50%, and the federal government determination that they would take an additional 2% of these revenues for, quote, administrative purposes is simply something that's unsupported by necessity, and it's a huge burden on states like mine. These revenues are crucially important for us for a whole range of important reasons, including things like school construction and funding. And it makes a huge difference to the state, and as Mr. Graves has said, and as previous amendments I've offered have pointed to, these are revenues that are by law ought to belong to the states. There's no reason that the federal government is skimming an additional 2%, and I would like to speak in strong support of Mr. Graves' amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is an amendment offered by Representative Graves designated as number 16. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed indicate by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Chairman, ask for a recorded vote.
Gentleman has requested a recorded vote, postponed as per prior announcement. Mr. Graves, you're recognized for Amendment 17.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd first like to, I want to correct the record. I don't want to leave anything distorted. Let me make note that in that last amendment, it actually didn't take specifically from the fund under the base text, or under the ANS or the base text. It allows for the Secretary to invest the unused portion of that trust fund to be invested in, to be made in investments, would generate a interest payment or some type of profit. And so specifically, the amendment would tap that additional amount, that interest payment amount. It doesn't tap the base $1.3 billion. So let me just correct the record on that. And so in reality, I keep referring to the $1.3 billion in mandatory spending each year, but with the interest payments, it'll actually be in excess of $1.3 billion. So when this bill comes to final passage, members of this committee will be voting on a bill that provides mandatory non-offset spending of in excess of $6.5 billion, putting it in front of everything else. Mr. Chairman, amendment number 17, this once again points out what this bill does, how it puts it in the front of the line. Maybe something that members of this committee care about is the deficit. I remember just last week we had members sitting here talking about the deficit, which was somewhat ironic considering the base text of the bill was going to appropriate tens of billions of dollars in mandatory spending, circumventing the appropriations process. So what this does is it simply says that in any year, when the deficit exceeds $1 trillion, if the deficit exceeds $1 trillion, that this doesn't apply, that the base text doesn't apply. So let me be clear. We have a debt right now that's in excess of $20 trillion. It's in excess of $20 trillion right now. And so if folks don't care about the debt, if they don't care about the deficit, if they don't care about the interest payments, I believe I read something, I'll probably be off a little bit, but I think it was by 2022, just the interest payments on the debt were going to exceed all of the money that we spend in a single year on Department of Defense activities around the world. And so let me say it again. This only would stop this $1.3 billion a year plus the interest payments. It'd only stop it in years where the deficit of this nation in that 1 year exceeds $1 trillion. $1 trillion. So if folks think this is monopoly money, then I urge you to vote no. Those of you that are here representing future generations, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, I urge you once again to support this amendment and just another opportunity to give you the chance to vote for good government, to actually pointing out some of the challenges or flaws with the underlying text here, and I urge adoption of the amendment. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. If there's no further discussion on the gentleman's amendment, number 17, all those in favor of that amendment indicate by saying aye. All those opposed indicate by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed. Graves, you're recognized for amendment number 18, sir.
Number 18. And Mr. Chairman, we're passing out one last amendment. It'll be number 21, and that will be the last one we do. So number 18, Mr. Chairman, last week, Mr. Chairman, it was fascinating to me to hear members talk about how they should have a say-so over what happens in these federal waters, and I resisted Mr. Huffman, my friend from California, from bringing up red snapper. But I want to give you an opportunity to talk about that today. What this amendment does is this amendment takes 10% of the funds. It reduces the 80% that goes to the National Park Service, drops it down to 70%, and puts 10% into a fund to address fish stocks, to address ecological productivity and rebuild fish stocks. I know that that's a priority of my friend, the chairman of the relevant subcommittee, the WOW subcommittee. And so this ensures that we're making investments, and this isn't limited to my friend's favorite species, red snapper. This actually, you could choose whatever fish you wanted. And this would go to states go to the federal agencies to make investments in the restoration of fish stocks and ensure that we have appropriate ecological productivity, that we have appropriate habitat, and that generations to come can enjoy fishing as we have and as our parents and grandparents and others have. I think this is an important investment. The talk about this whole bill is how we're taking investments from energy revenues and we're investing it back in resources that all Americans can enjoy. Well, certainly this is something that all Americans can enjoy, the fishing and enjoying the bounty of our coast around the United States. And I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Will the prolific gentleman from Louisiana?
Absolutely. I'm more than happy to.
Certainly, I would say that rebuilding fish stocks is an important cause. I'd love to work with the gentleman on that. There's a whole bunch of other things I'd like to work with him on as well. But we have an opportunity today to do something together, to pass a good bill in a bipartisan way that helps parks and helps address the maintenance backlog that we all would like to tackle. Let's get that done today, and let's work on that other stuff separately. You have my commitment to do that, but let's not cannibalize a good bill for the sake of the many other causes that we would love to accomplish at the same time. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, and I certainly would love to work with you. I agree with everything you said, except for the underlying bill was good, but I do appreciate that, and I do hope that the chairman, subcommittee chairman, and the full committee chairman are able to come to Louisiana as we've discussed in the past. I can't tell you how much I appreciate Mr. Lowenthal coming down. Yeah, absolutely. I do a little coastal sampling. I can't tell you how much I appreciate Mr. Lowenthal coming down, and I told him on the way down, I said, look, I'm not asking you to vote with us or to say that we're great people or anything else. I just want you to understand what it is that we're representing and why we're fighting for the people that we're fighting for. So again, I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Hearing no further debate, the question is on amendment number 18 offered by Representative Graves. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed indicate by saying no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Recorded vote, please, Mr. Chairman.
Recorded vote has been requested and postponed as per prior notification. Amendment number 19.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, you're familiar with the Social Security Trust Fund and the insolvency challenges. It has been determined that the trust fund is going to be insolvent. I think it's by 2035, if I remember correctly, is the latest estimate. I remind you, Mr. Chairman, that Congress has taken billions and billions of dollars out of the Social Security Trust Fund. It's removed those dollars, and it has used them for other government functions. In the private sector, that's called embezzling. In government, that's called budgeting, apparently. And so if the trust fund is insolvent, then we need to ensure that we're not taking additional funds and doing mandatory spending that takes it out of the appropriations process if those investments are not priorities. And I don't want to get accused of being hypocritical later on, because yes, I want mandatory spending for revenue sharing for the coast of Louisiana, because I believe that is going to be a return on investment for taxpayers as opposed to a liability. And so, Mr. Chairman, this amendment simply says that this bill doesn't kick in, it doesn't take effect if the solvency of our trust fund is in question over the next 20 years. And so it would allow us to ensure that all the resources that this nation has, that our taxpayers have, can be thoroughly vetted and prioritized and determine that our Social Security system can be stabilized, can be invested in and remain solvent, that perhaps we can return some of the IOUs or thieving that previous Congresses have taken funds from the Social Security Trust Fund, and just ensuring that we have a retirement program for our seniors in future years. So I urge adoption of this amendment and yield back.
Yields back. Hearing no further debate on the amendment. All those in favor of amendment number 19 indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested by the gentleman and postponed as per prior notification. Mr. Graves, amendment number 20, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, amendment number 20 is pretty simple. Under the base text of the bill, what it does is it takes a portion of all energy revenues, and it doesn't discriminate if it's onshore or offshore. It's all energy revenues, and takes a portion of those in excess of those that are dedicated and puts them into this new trust fund for maintenance that's established under the bill. What this does is it says, look, if you want to do that from onshore, that's fine. You do it from onshore energy, not the offshore. Let us come back and have discussions, as we talked about at the opening. Let us have discussions about revenue sharing for coastal states and ensuring that our communities are prepared for future natural disasters like hurricanes, ensuring that that we can make sure these communities are resilient, make sure these communities were sustainable. Mr. Chairman, I don't have to tell you the communities in Houston, the communities in Galveston, in Corpus Christi, those that suffered, the communities in South Florida, the communities in Puerto Rico, the communities in the Virgin Islands, North Carolina, and other places. They were completely devastated. Those of you that didn't see the pictures from Hurricane Michael, and what it did in just blazing a clear-cut path over the panhandle of Florida in the vicinity of Panama City. Making sure, Mr. Chairman, that we save the opportunity to come in and make investments in these coastal communities and in the resilience of these areas and these people, these families, these homes, these businesses, and ensure that next time we have a natural disaster, next time we have a hurricane, that it's a rain event, not complete devastation, not loss of all your material possessions, not death and destruction, as we've seen in the last few years from these hurricane seasons. So it allows us to come back and have that discussion. It doesn't gut the bill. My guess is that you'll still be hitting your target, and I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
If there's no further debate on Mr. Graves' amendment number 20, I would ask all those in favor of the amendment to indicate by saying aye. All those opposed indicate by saying no. No. The opinion of the chair is the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Graves, you are recognized for amendment number 21.
Mr. Chairman, this is amendment number 21. I heard a rumor that someone may raise a point of order. We can create another one, maybe. Maybe we can do another amendment. But Mr. Chairman, this amendment is text that perhaps some of you may recognize. It was an amendment that was offered to the last Congress, and what it would do is it would take funds, and let's be clear in this case, it would take funds in excess of, not what this base bill does, but it would take funds in excess of those that are currently projected under the Gulf of Mexico, well, not projected. It would take funds in excess of those that are committed under the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, under GOMESA, under that revenue sharing portion, and it would create the funds in excess of those, and it would create a program for all coastal states and territories. So my friends from California, my friend from Alaska, my friend from California, New Jersey, South Carolina, that all of you, actually, my friend from Michigan, I think y'all would be eligible as well. That all of you would have the opportunity to apply for this coastal grant program, where the funds could be used to make investments in our coastal resources. There is one spot in here where I did draw a line through the text, and that's because I believe there was a drafting error in the original drafting of this amendment, and I just wanted to make sure that we took that out. But this would simply take funds in excess of those that are allowed under the cap, under the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act. It would put those funds into a trust fund that could be utilized for coastal investments, coastal sustainability. I worked just last Congress with my friend from Massachusetts, Congressman Seth Moulton, on similar legislation that would make investments in our coastal communities. And so this is similar to what the objectives of that bill does, and I urge adoption of this amendment and look forward to unanimous passage. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Amendment number 21, hearing no further debate. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed indicate by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Gentleman has requested a recorded vote and a postpone pursuant to my prior announcement. We're gonna recess and pause for about 5 to 6 minutes while we wait for the rest of the members, because we indicated we would start voting at 1 o'clock, and to give them an opportunity to get here, and we'll reconvene almost immediately. We'll be. Yeah. So we're gonna recess subject to the call of the chair. Thank you. Returning to HR 823, the question is in the unfinished business, the amendments to Mr. Neguse's ANS. The first amendment designated Curtis number 1. The members will record their votes, and voting is now open. Yes. This Curtis number 1. Is it? Yeah. Has everybody voted? Every member voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? If every member confirmed the vote is now closed. And the clerk will please report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 14 and the nays are 21.
The nays have it, the amendment fails. Next amendment is amendment designated GOSAR number 2. Members will record their votes. Voting is open. Nothing. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? If not, every member confirm their vote. Voting is closed. Clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 15 and the nays are 21.
The nays have it. The amendment fails. Amendment designated McClintock number 5. Members record their vote. Voting is open. Has every member confirmed their vote? The vote is now closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 15 and the nays are 23.
The nays have it. The amendment fails. The amendment designated Lambourne number 4. The voting is now open. Has every member confirmed their vote? The vote is now closed. Clerk will report, please.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 17 and the nays are 21.
The nays have it. The amendment fails. The amendment designated Westerman number 3. Voting is now open. Has every member confirmed their vote? The voting is now closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 16 and the nays are 22.
The nays have it. The amendment fails. The question is now on Mr. Neguse's ANS as amended to HR 823. Those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed indicate by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the ANS is agreed to as amended. The question now is on adopting HR 823 as amended and order it favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed indicate by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. A recorded vote has been requested. Members will record. The question, the question is on final passage and order of HR and order the legislation favorably reported as amended. Members will record their vote. The voting is open. Oh. Yeah. I was still to see if I had any influence, obviously not.
We believe you.
Yeah, well, landlord, I don't think if that's going to work too well for me in the long run. The voting is, every member confirmed their vote? If so, voting is closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 23 and the nays are 15.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Bishop.
Huh?
Mr. Bishop, do you want to make your motion? Oh, yeah.
Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. Under Committee Rule 5C, I give notice of my intention to file additional dissenting views on the bill just considered, and I ask unanimous consent that this notice be extended to all members of the committee and to apply to all bills being considered by the committee today.
Returning now to HR 1225, the question is on the unfinished business, the amendments to the ANS, beginning with amendment designated Graves number 2. Members will record their vote. The voting is open. Has every member confirmed their vote? The vote is now closed. The clerk will report, please.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 7 and the nays are 31.
The nays have it. The amendment fails. The amendment designated Graves number 3. Voting is now open. Has everybody confirmed their vote? I remember, no. Does every member confirm their vote? The vote is now closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 4 and the nays are 34.
The nays have it. The amendment fails. The amendment designated Graves number 4. Voting is now open. Has everybody confirmed their vote? Flipped. Has everybody confirmed their vote? The vote is now closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 6 and the nays are 32.
The nays have it. The amendment fails. And the amendment designated Graves number 6. The voting is now open. Has every member confirmed their vote? The vote is now closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 6 and the nays are 32.
The nays have it. The amendment fails. The amendment designated Graves number 9, excuse me, correction. The amendment designated Graves number 9. The voting is now open.
Mr. Chairman, I believe we've skipped votes on a couple of amendments. I know I didn't call for votes on all of them, but did we vote on number 5?
You didn't request a roll call on that? 7, 8, and 10.
I'm gonna, I think I did. I can go back and double check, but I thought I'd asked for a roll call vote on this one.
Okay.
And on the baseline, on number 5.
You guys got to get your shit together. Jesus Christ.
Let me see what.
Does every member confirm their vote on number 9? The voting is now closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 6 and the nays are 32.
The nays have it. The amendment fails. The amendment designated Graves number 11. The voting is now open. Did I get it? Every member confirmed their vote. The vote is now closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 5 and the nays are 33.
The nays have it. The amendment fails. The amendment designated Graves number 13. The voting is now open. Confirm their vote? Lowenthal? If all votes confirmed, voting is closed. The clerk will please report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 9 and the nays are 29.
The nays have it, the amendment fails. Amendment designated number 15, the voting is open. Has everybody confirmed their vote? If so, the voting is closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 8 and the nays are 30.
The nays have it, the amendment fails. The amendment designated number 6, Graves 16, voting is open. Has every member confirmed their vote? Ms. Villa. If so, the voting is now closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 14 yeas and 24 nays.
The nays have it. The amendment fails. The amendment designated Graves number 18. Voting is open. That last was when you had to vote for. The last one.
Mr. Chairman, I have a parliamentary inquiry. Mr. Chairman, if when we go back and watch the video, if I call for a recorded vote on one of them that we've skipped over, how would that be handled?
Well, there's no going back. The discretion would be at this point, Mr. Graves, and we have both majority, minority staff confirming that there was no request on that, the clerk, and the other staff that are with the clerk confirming that there was no request for a recorded vote. And that's the information and my own hearing that I'm working off of. And so the discretion would be that at this point, I don't see any need to go back and reopen this again, sir.
Further parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, is it possible to, at this point, ask for a recorded vote on number 17?
Time has passed on that amendment, sir. We are now on amendment designated number 18.
Mr. Chairman?
Hang on. Everybody confirm their vote on Graves 18. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 4 and the nays are 34.
The nays have it. The amendment fails. Graves amendment designated 19. The voting is now open. Confirm their vote? If so, voting is closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 7 and the nays are 31.
The nays have it. The amendment fails. Amendment designated Graves number 21. Voting is open. Has every member confirmed their vote? Voting is now closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 9 and the nays are 29.
The ayes have it. The amendment fails. The question is on ANS to HR 1225. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the ANS is agreed to. The question is on adopting HR 1225 as amended and order it favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote being requested. The members will record their vote. Is every member, not yet. And then, I don't have to do this, right? Does every member confirm their vote? The clerk will report. Voting is closed.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 36 and the nays are 2.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I want to thank all the members for their attention and participation today. Very much appreciated. All members shall have 2 days in which to file supplemental additional minority or dissenting views. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill order reported today. I ask unanimous consent for any bill order reported today with amendments that the bill be considered reported with an amendment to strike out all the enacted clause and insert the text of the bill with its perfecting amendment. Without objection, so ordered. Thank you, Ranking Member Bishop and other members of the committee for moving the legislation today. No further business.
We're
Meeting is adjourned.
voting on the floor right now. They've just called votes on the floor.